The relocation of the imperial court to Heian in the year 794 signaled more than the construction of a new capital. It represented the start of a new political rhythm, one that would steadily distance the court from the practical concerns of governing the provinces. Emperor Kanmu's decision to shift from Nara to Heian-kyo, later known as Kyoto, was meant to strengthen central control and stabilize imperial rule, but its effects rippled in unexpected ways. The gleaming palaces and carefully planned avenues of the new capital emphasized elegance and cultural refinement, while distant provinces slipped slowly from the grasp of central authority. What began as a calculated act of political consolidation became the soil in which a warrior class would take root. In the serene halls of the Heian court, aristocrats focused their attention on poetry, elaborate rituals, and the aesthetics of daily life. The rhythm of governance grew increasingly ceremonial, guided by imported Chinese ideals and Buddhist practices. Matters of defense, taxation, and order in the countryside seemed beneath the cultivated sensibilities of the nobility. Rather than personally enforcing authority in the provinces, they chose to delegate. Estate managers and local strongmen were entrusted with responsibilities that at first seemed temporary, such as collecting taxes and maintaining peace. Yet these appointments gradually hardened into hereditary positions, embedding power in families who knew the land, commanded local loyalty, and held armed followers. The aristocracy, comfortable in their refined surroundings, became absentee landlords. Their distant estates were not watched over directly but entrusted to these provincial managers. Over time, those men grew indispensable. They wielded influence not only as collectors of revenue, but as protectors of the fields and villages. They commanded small bands of mounted fighters who were better suited to the rugged terrain and unpredictable conflicts than the ineffective conscript forces of earlier centuries. While the court prized distant ancestry and bureaucratic seniority, these men cultivated authority through tangible action, keeping order, defending territory, and rewarding followers. It was a subtle but steady transformation. The conscript armies of earlier ages had drained the treasury and offered little security. By contrast, provincial fighters maintained their own equipment, their own horses, and their own discipline. They owed their loyalty not to the abstract concept of an emperor far away in Heian, but to the man who provided for them, who shared victories and hardships with them. The bonds forged on the frontier were closer, more personal, and far more resilient than the paper decrees of a distant court. Nowhere was this transformation more apparent than in the campaigns fought against the Emishi people of northern Honshu. These conflicts stretched for centuries, demanding constant vigilance and adaptability. The Emishi, fierce horsemen and skilled archers, resisted imperial expansion with ambushes, surprise raids, and mastery of the rugged landscape. They fought not in ordered ranks, but with fluid movements that baffled the rigid Chinese-inspired strategies favored by the court. To match them, provincial warriors learned to prize initiative, speed, and accuracy. They honed their archery until it became an art, guiding horses with their knees while releasing arrows in fluid, deadly arcs. The frontier forged not only technique, but mentality. To survive, a warrior needed more than strength. He required calm under pressure, a readiness to act decisively, and a personal sense of honor that held him steady in the chaos of sudden attack. Victories brought real rewards, grants of land, appointments in the capital, opportunities for wealth. Defeats brought death or exile. The stakes were tangible, and so the warrior's ethos grew practical and unyielding. Success came not through lofty titles, but through skill and courage, a sharp contrast to the courtly world of Heian, where poetry competitions could determine prestige. As decades passed, the most capable commanders attracted bands of followers. Men pledged service to leaders who proved themselves in battle, receiving protection and the promise of advancement. The ties between leader and follower were sealed not in dusty archives but in oaths, shared hardships, and mutual reliance. Small groups coalesced into larger networks, laying the groundwork for clans that would dominate the political landscape of Japan for centuries. By the 10th century, these provincial families had become more than stewards of aristocratic estates. They were a new social force, a warrior class distinct from both the noble courtiers and the agricultural peasants. Their authority rested on arms, their wealth on land, and their honor on personal valor. The court, absorbed in ceremony and distant from the realities of governance, often saw them as both necessary allies and troubling rivals. Yet dependence on their military strength left the nobles with little choice. Out of this slow transformation, the clans that would later contest for supremacy began to emerge. The seeds of the Minamoto and the Taira were already present in these centuries, their roots tied to imperial bloodlines, but their strength built on provincial soil. The rise of these families was not an accident, but the natural result of power flowing away from an ornamental court and into the hands of those willing to seize it. The age of warriors had begun to dawn, quietly but inexorably, in the gaps left by an aristocracy too enamored with culture to notice the shifting of power beneath its feet. The northern frontier of Honshu was more than a distant borderland. It was a testing ground where the shape of a new warrior ethos was hammered into being. The long struggle against the Emishi people was not a brief campaign but a drawn-out crucible that spanned generations. These opponents were unlike the orderly enemies imagined in Chinese military treatises. They were mobile, unpredictable, and intimately familiar with the forests, rivers, and mountain passes of their homeland. They struck suddenly and vanished just as quickly, leaving imperial soldiers confused and vulnerable. Against such an enemy, only men hardened by constant danger could survive. The Emishi fought from horseback with remarkable agility, firing arrows with deadly precision. Their tactics confounded the rigid formations of earlier armies, where soldiers advanced in set ranks under the commands of distant officers. To meet this threat, provincial fighters had to abandon ceremony and adopt flexibility. They learned to trust their own judgment in the chaos of skirmish, to act swiftly when opportunity presented itself. Initiative, accuracy, and calm under pressure became the virtues of the warrior. These were not values nurtured in the quiet halls of Heian, but in the smoke and mud of ambushes, in the silence before an arrow found its mark. The long campaigns reshaped both technique and identity. Mounted archery emerged as the supreme skill, a discipline requiring years of training from youth. Boys born into provincial warrior families grew up riding small but resilient horses, guiding them without hands so that both arms could be devoted to the bow. The bow itself was no ordinary weapon. Crafted of bamboo and wood, taller than the man who held it, it demanded strength to draw and precision to master. Arrows flew farther and struck harder than those of foot archers, and the warrior who could maintain composure while loosing shafts from a galloping horse won respect and honor among his peers. Survival in this world depended on personal prowess more than on any distant imperial authority. Victories yielded land, wealth, and rank. Defeat meant not only death but the ruin of a family's standing, for these campaigns were not fought for abstract loyalty alone. They were battles of survival and advancement, where success opened doors to titles and influence within the court itself. Over time, the men who excelled became more than fighters. They became leaders of bands bound by personal ties of loyalty, forged not through bureaucratic chains but through shared danger and reward. From these small groups, larger clans began to take shape. Families with ambition and skill drew retainers who trusted them for protection and opportunity. The bond between leader and follower was not impersonal, as in the distant court, but sealed by personal oaths and shared spoils. The battlefield was both proving ground and marketplace, where loyalty was exchanged for security and honor was measured in the blood of enemies. The experience of the frontier also shaped a philosophy, though it was not yet articulated in words or codes. Warriors learned to value effectiveness above form, courage above ceremony, loyalty above abstract law. A man who could protect his companions and triumph over adversaries deserved allegiance regardless of his standing at court. These values, born from necessity, grew into traditions that distinguished the emerging warrior class from the nobility who debated poetry competitions in the capital. As the generations passed, the echoes of these frontier struggles spread throughout Japan. Tales of daring raids, of warriors who survived impossible odds, inspired admiration and imitation. The names of successful commanders traveled far beyond the mountains of the north, attracting ambitious men who sought service under leaders of proven skill. The authority of such commanders grew not from birthright alone, but from demonstrated ability. In time, the reputation of certain families spread widely, and their influence reached into the provinces far from the original frontier. They began to build fortified compounds, places where followers could gather and where wealth from land and conquest could be guarded. The countryside, once dominated by scattered villages and isolated estates, now bore the marks of men who lived by the bow, the horse, and the sword. The northern campaigns were not the end of the Emishi struggle, but a turning point for Japan itself. In fighting an enemy who demanded resilience and creativity, the provincial fighters had become something new. They were no longer simply estate managers or tax collectors. They had become warriors, defined by their weapons, their skills, and their unwavering bonds to one another. The legacy of the frontier would continue to shape the ethos of this class, leaving marks that would endure long after the emishi themselves faded into history. The men who had once been mere managers of estates or commanders on the frontier now began to weave their growing influence into lineages that reached back to the imperial house itself. Out of this merging of provincial might and noble ancestry, the great clans emerged, destined to dominate Japanese politics and warfare for centuries. Two families in particular, the Minamoto and the Taira, rose as symbols of this transformation. Each traced its bloodline to emperors of the past, each built vast networks of alliances in the provinces, and each claimed legitimacy that gave their growing power an air of inevitability. The Minamoto, also known as the Genji, claimed descent from Emperor Seiwa, a connection that, though distant, gave them an imperial sheen. They established their strongest base in the Kanto Plain, a region of fertile fields and wide river valleys. Here they cultivated bonds with landowners, monastic communities, and smaller warrior families. The Kanto was not a refined landscape like the capital's polished avenues. It was open country, exposed to rivalries and conflict, and well suited to those who thrived through strength and vigilance. The Minamoto adapted perfectly to this environment, erecting fortified compounds that served not only as residences, but as centers of administration and defense. These compounds rose on elevated ground with sweeping views of the countryside, their wooden palisades and watchtowers standing as symbols of protection and authority. Inside, storehouses held weapons, armor, and provisions to sustain the clan through sieges or extended campaigns. The main residence, influenced by the Shindenzukuri style of the nobility, was reshaped to serve practical purposes, combining elegance with defensive readiness. The Minamoto presence across the Kanto created a network of power that extended beyond a single stronghold, binding together smaller warrior families who looked to them for leadership. The Taira, also called the Heike, pursued a different path. Their descent was traced to Emperor Kamu, another imperial link that conferred prestige. Their base of strength lay first in the western provinces, where they cultivated ties with maritime trade routes and the court itself. In contrast to the Minamoto's inland orientation, the Taira embraced the sea. From their base at Itsukushima, with its famous floating torii gate rising from the water, they projected an image that blended military force with religious authority. Their fleet dominated the inland sea, controlling the arteries of commerce that connected Japan's regions. Trade, tolls, and transport filled their coffers, enabling them to maintain armies and extend their reach. The economic foundation of the Taira's maritime power gave them a flexibility their land-based rivals lacked. Wealth from the sea funded military ventures and offered leverage at court, where gifts and bribes often mattered as much as loyalty or lineage. They maintained close connections with Kyoto, weaving their influence directly into the imperial capital. Their ships gave them mobility, allowing rapid responses to threats and opportunities alike, and their command of trade routes made them indispensable to merchants and courtiers seeking profit. Both clans used genealogy as a weapon. Claims of imperial descent, whether meticulously recorded or lightly embellished, were crucial in a society where bloodlines conferred legitimacy. The truth mattered less than the acceptance of others. If followers, rivals, and courtiers acknowledged the lineage, then the claim carried weight. For the Minamoto and the Taira, imperial ancestry provided justification for actions that might otherwise have been branded as rebellion. They could claim not to be undermining the throne, but fulfilling their heritage as protectors of the realm. As their strength grew, so too did the rivalry between them. The Minamoto relied on the loyalty of eastern landowners and the steady building of provincial alliances. Their power was rooted in the earth, in rice fields and fortified manors. The Taira drew from the sea, from commerce and ships that carried both goods and warriors. Their power was woven into the court, where they maneuvered with cunning and ambition. Each clan represented a different face of the emerging warrior order, one provincial and agrarian, the other maritime and aristocratic, yet both were destined to clash as their ambitions expanded beyond their regions. The rise of these clans marked the transition from scattered bands of warriors to organized houses with resources, strategies, and visions of broader dominion. They were no longer local guardians but architects of political futures. Their fortified compounds and fleets were outward signs of the deeper transformation underway, a shift from personal oaths of loyalty to institutionalized clan structures capable of shaping the destiny of the nation. It was within this tension between land and sea, east and west, provincial and courtly, that the stage was set for the wars that would soon engulf the country. The Minamoto and Taira, both born of the same imperial blood, yet molded by different environments, stood as twin pillars of a new age. Between them, Japan would soon discover the devastating power of civil war and the emergence of a warrior government that would overshadow the imperial throne itself. The rise of the warrior clans was inseparable from the tools they carried and the protection they wore. Weapons and armor were not only instruments of survival, but symbols of identity, shaped by centuries of adaptation to Japan's landscape and the demands of its conflicts. The early samurai did not emerge fully formed with the elegance of later ages. Their equipment evolved through trial and error, through the lessons of frontier warfare, and through the realities of combat against both native foes and rival warriors. The longbow, or yumi, stood at the heart of this martial identity. Unlike the symmetrical bows of many other lands, the Japanese bow was asymmetrical, with the grip positioned closer to the lower third of the weapon. Crafted from bamboo and wood in layered construction, the bow measured more than 2 meters in length and possessed both flexibility and immense power. From horseback, it could deliver arrows at ranges of over 200 meters, a feat unmatched by the short bows of continental infantry. The bow was not merely a weapon but a discipline, demanding years of training to master. Warriors practiced until they could guide their horses with their knees while loosing arrows in quick succession, striking accurately even as they galloped across uneven ground. The arrows themselves were crafted with deliberate variety. Some were fitted with narrow, piercing heads to penetrate armor, others with wide blades to tear unprotected flesh, and still others designed to carry flame. Each served a tactical purpose, and warriors carried bundles of mixed shafts to be chosen according to the situation. Mounted archery, or yabusame, became both a practical technique and a ritual expression of martial skill, preserved in ceremonies long after its battlefield supremacy declined. Alongside the bow, the sword began its gradual ascent to prominence. Early blades were straight, modelled on Chinese and Korean designs, but constant use revealed their limitations. In the hands of swordsmiths, the weapon transformed into the curved, single-edged blade that would become iconic. The curvature allowed for swift drawing and cutting in a single motion, while the forging process created a blade both sharp and resilient. Swordsmiths developed methods of differential hardening, giving the edge strength for cutting while leaving the spine flexible enough to absorb shock. Although these early swords lacked the refinement of later masterpieces, they embodied advances in craftsmanship that reflected a culture increasingly devoted to martial excellence. Armor, too, bore the marks of innovation and necessity. The style known as oyoroi consisted of small plates of iron or hardened leather, lacquered against rain and laced together with silk cords. These plates created a box-like cuirass that could deflect arrows while still granting mobility to an archer on horseback. The ensemble included shoulder guards, shin protectors, and sleeves of armor that wrapped the forearms. The kabuto, or helmet, was equally distinctive, often adorned with crests and horns, but designed above all to shield the head and neck from arrows and blows. A menpo, or face mask, guarded the cheeks and nose, lending the warrior a fearsome visage while adding practical defense. The total weight of this armor was considerable, often 20 to 25 kilograms, yet it was balanced to be worn for long periods. Warriors needed to remain mounted for days in extended campaigns, moving across rivers and mountains, and their armor had to endure both combat and the elements. The lacquer that covered the plates provided protection from rain and humidity, preserving the strength of the materials. In its combination of function and artistry, the armor symbolized both the harshness of battle and the aesthetic sensibilities of the society that created it. Spears and polearms also played their part. The yari, initially a simple thrusting weapon, grew in importance as conflicts expanded and formations became more complex. Its reach made it effective against cavalry charges, while its versatility allowed warriors on foot to engage both mounted opponents and other infantry. Though the sword would come to dominate samurai lore, the spear was often more practical in the heat of battle, where reach and thrusting power could determine survival. Every piece of this martial ensemble reflected adaptation to Japan's terrain and style of warfare. Horses bred smaller than those on the continent proved agile on mountain paths, carrying warriors who prized maneuverability over sheer weight. Armor balanced defense with endurance, enabling fighters to travel far while remaining protected. Weapons emphasized speed, accuracy, and the capacity for sudden violence, matching the realities of ambush and skirmish rather than rigid battlefield lines. These tools, refined through centuries of conflict, also began to shape the image of the warrior in the eyes of others. The bow, slung across the back, the sword at the hip, the armor gleaming with lacquer and cords of bright silk. Such images became markers of status as well as instruments of war. To wear armor was to stand apart from peasants, courtiers, and monks. To wield the bow or sword was to belong to a new class defined by skill at arms and loyalty to leaders. In the crucible of combat, weapons and armor were not abstractions. They were the difference between life and death, between victory and obscurity. Yet they were also carriers of meaning, embodying values of discipline, endurance, and aesthetic refinement. Through them, the samurai proclaimed who they were, not merely servants of an absent court, but warriors who lived and died by their own strength. The warrior's life demanded more than equipment and bloodline. It required a discipline that began in childhood and never truly ended. To be born into a provincial warrior family was to step immediately onto a path of training, where body, mind, and spirit were molded together into a life of service. From the earliest years, boys were taught to ride, to shoot, and to endure the hardships of a life that would demand constant readiness. The path was not simply martial instruction, but the cultivation of a way of being that marked them as distinct from farmers, courtiers, and monks. Horsemanship stood at the foundation of this training. The bow was the samurai's signature weapon, but without mastery of the horse, it could not be used to full effect. Children were placed on horseback at an age when others were still learning to walk confidently on the ground. They learned to guide animals with their knees, to feel the movement of muscle and bone beneath them, and to control their mounts while freeing their hands for the bow. Hours of practice on open fields and narrow trails alike built confidence until rider and horse seemed a single unit. Archery followed closely. Boys practiced drawing the great asymmetrical bow long before they had the strength to use it in battle. They developed the muscle memory of the draw, the alignment of the body, the release of the arrow. Wooden targets gave way to moving ones, and eventually to live practice from horseback. Each stage demanded patience and repetition, building not only skill, but the calm focus needed to strike under pressure. Mounted archery was not merely a technique, but a discipline requiring breath control, balance, and steady nerves in the face of chaos. Yet martial training extended far beyond the bow and horse. Spears, swords, and daggers each had their place in the education of a warrior. The yari offered reach and precision. The sword demanded fluid movements that could cut or parry with equal grace, while the dagger provided the final defense when all else failed. Swimming and climbing were also taught, for rivers and mountains were as constant in Japan as the enemies who might be encountered upon them. Wrestling, running, and other forms of physical conditioning kept the body strong and flexible, prepared for long campaigns and sudden clashes. The discipline of the mind was equally vital. From an early age, meditation was introduced, borrowing practices from Buddhist and Shinto traditions. A boy was taught to quiet his thoughts, to still his emotions, to find clarity even in the face of fear. Such training prepared him not only for battle, but for the long silences between battles, when patience and vigilance were as necessary as courage. Rituals at shrines and temples reinforced the sense that unseen forces shaped fortune, and that harmony with these forces could mean survival. Warriors sought blessings before campaigns, believing that their spirits would be guarded if their hearts were disciplined. Mentorship played an essential role. Young warriors learned under the watch of elders who passed down both technique and philosophy. Instruction came not only through words but through example, as boys watched their fathers and uncles endure hardship, maintain composure, and treat loyalty as sacred. Tales of ancestors who had faced overwhelming odds were told not simply as entertainment, but as lessons in endurance and honor. Every story became a guidepost, reminding the young that the warrior's path was not about comfort or ease, but about perseverance. Training also instilled an early understanding of loyalty. A young warrior learned that his life was not solely his own, but bound to his lord, his clan, and his companions. Oaths of service were spoken solemnly, binding the individual to something larger than himself. The sense of belonging to a unit, of sharing danger and reward, was cultivated until it became second nature. A warrior who thought only of himself could not be trusted in battle. A warrior who placed his comrades above his own safety was honored, remembered, and followed. discipline extended into daily life. Meals were simple, often designed to strengthen rather than indulge. Sleep could be cut short at the sound of a horn, for readiness at any hour was essential. Even leisure was shaped by training, with archery contests, wrestling matches, and riding games serving both as recreation and practice. The boundaries between life and preparation blurred until every act reinforced the skills and mindset of a fighter. In time, this comprehensive training produced individuals who were more than soldiers. They were practitioners of a way that fused body, mind, and spirit. They were taught not only how to fight, but how to endure, how to remain calm when storms broke around them, how to live with the knowledge that death was never far away. Their discipline became their armor, as much as lacquered plates and silk cords, and it was this inner strength that set them apart. Through years of rigorous instruction, a warrior's identity was forged. He was no longer simply a boy of the provinces, but a member of a distinct class, one bound by training, loyalty, and a code of conduct that grew clearer with each generation. The samurai were becoming not just fighters, but symbols of discipline, honor, and service, their training a reflection of the life they were sworn to lead. The foundation of a warrior's power rested not only on weapons and training, but on the soil beneath his feet. Land was the currency of authority, the source of sustenance, and the measure of wealth. For the provincial warrior families rising in the shadow of the court, control of territory meant far more than prestige. It meant the ability to feed retainers, supply armies, and reward loyalty. Unlike the aristocrats of Heian who owned vast estates but seldom saw them, warriors lived close to their land and drew strength directly from it. The countryside of Japan was dotted with rice paddies, small villages, and forests that provided both food and materials. To command these resources was to command people, for peasants were bound to the fields they cultivated. The warrior who held the land held the right to tax its yield, to defend it, and to demand service from those who lived upon it. Over time, this bond between land and warrior grew so strong that military power and economic power became indistinguishable. A man standing in the hierarchy of warriors was measured not only by his lineage, but by the size and productivity of his domain. What set the Japanese system apart from European feudalism was its fluidity. In Europe, kings and lords granted land to vassals as a formal gift of service, establishing a strict chain of obligation. In Japan, land could be acquired in multiple ways: by inheritance, by direct cultivation of unused fields, by conquest, or through advantageous marriages. Warriors did not always wait for land to be bestowed. They sought it actively, treating it as both prize and tool. This entrepreneurial approach gave the warrior class a dynamic character, one that encouraged ambition and rewarded initiative. Control of land was not abstract. Warriors lived among their holdings, building fortified compounds that served as both residences and administrative centers. From these strongholds, they collected rents, enforced order, and oversaw agricultural production. They were not remote landlords, but constant presences, visible symbols of authority who could summon their followers at need. Their power was sustained by direct involvement, which gave them a closeness to their people that distant courtiers could not match. The relationship between warriors and peasants was complex. On one hand, peasants labored under heavy burdens, providing rice and other crops as tax to their overlords. On the other, warriors depended entirely on their productivity. Excessive demands could drive villages into ruin, weakening the warrior who relied upon them. Thus, a balance had to be struck. Wise leaders maintained order and stability, ensuring that peasants remained productive. Protection from bandits, rival clans, or natural calamities was expected in return for tribute, creating a reciprocal bond that reinforced the warrior's legitimacy. Economic independence strengthened the warrior's political position. The court could grant titles and honors, but these were empty without resources to support them. Provincial fighters who commanded fertile lands and loyal peasants found themselves less dependent on Kyoto's approval. They could negotiate from positions of strength, their wealth built on rice harvests, and their armies supplied directly from their own domains. This autonomy gradually eroded the absolute power of the central court, shifting influence to the countryside where warriors thrived. Trade added another layer to this economic foundation. Surpluses from agriculture allowed some domains to exchange rice and other goods for weapons, horses, or luxury items. Coastal warriors, like the Taira, leveraged maritime trade to build immense fortunes, while inland families exchanged goods along river routes and mountain passes. The warrior's role expanded from defender of land to manager of commerce, overseeing exchanges that enriched both clan and retainers. Religious institutions also played a role. Monasteries owned vast tracts of land and often wielded economic power equal to that of clans. Some warriors allied with Buddhist temples, offering military protection in return for spiritual legitimacy and access to temple wealth. Others clashed with monastic forces seeking to absorb their estates. Either way, the intertwining of warrior authority and religious holdings reflected the centrality of land as a source of both material and spiritual strength. By the 10th and 11th centuries, warriors had carved for themselves a place distinct from the nobility and the peasantry. They were not courtiers reciting poems in Kyoto, nor were they labourers bent over paddies. They were a new class whose identity was bound to the land they controlled and the armed men who defended it. Their rise represented a profound transformation in Japanese society, one that shifted the axis of power from the capital to the provinces. The land gave the warrior not only food and wealth, but also permanence. Titles could be stripped and fortunes could change, but land endured. It tied families to regions for generations, binding their name to the soil as surely as their bloodline tied them to emperors of the past. The fields and villages became both the foundation of daily life and the stage on which struggles for supremacy would be fought. The year 1156 marked a turning point when the smouldering tension between court nobility and warrior families erupted in the streets of Kyoto itself. This conflict, remembered as the Hogan Rebellion, revealed with brutal clarity how indispensable the samurai had become to the politics of the realm. For centuries, the court had relied on provincial fighters to guard its lands and enforce its decrees, but never before had the warriors turned their weapons upon one another in the very shadow of the imperial palace. The rebellion was not only a clash of armies, but a demonstration that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The spark came with the death of Emperor Toba, which left a disputed succession. Two rival factions emerged. On one side stood the retired Emperor Sutoku, seeking to reclaim influence with the support of sympathetic courtiers. On the other was Emperor Go-Shirakawa, his younger half-brother, backed by a different coalition within the court. What might once have been resolved through ritual and negotiation now demanded military resolution. Both factions turned to the Minamoto and the Taira, whose armies of mounted archers could decide the contest. The Minamoto themselves split. Minamoto no Tamayoshi, head of the clan, cast his lot with Sutoku, while his son, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, sided with Go-Shirakawa. The Taira, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, also threw their strength behind Go-Shirakawa. The result was a bewildering tangle of loyalties that pitted father against son, kinsman against kinsman, all in the name of imperial legitimacy. The warriors who had once united to defend the state were now openly shaping its fate. The fighting broke out near the Shirakawa Palace in Kyoto. For the courtiers, the sight was astonishing and horrifying. Bands of armored horsemen loosing arrows into the night, the crackle of fire consuming wooden halls, the clash of steel echoing through streets once reserved for ceremony. Warriors had brought the violence of the provinces into the very center of the empire. Chroniclers describe houses set ablaze and fleeing nobles caught in the confusion, powerless against men trained for the field. In the chaos, the superiority of discipline and numbers decided the struggle. Taira no Kiyomori and Minamoto no Yoshitomo coordinated their forces effectively, surrounding the palace of their rivals and setting it alight. Those loyal to Sutoku fought desperately, but their resistance collapsed under pressure. The victors demonstrated no hesitation in meting out punishment. Sutoku was forced into exile, his supporters executed or stripped of rank. The taboo against harming imperial kin was shattered, as members of the imperial line suffered consequences once unthinkable. The Hogan Rebellion left a scar deeper than the ashes of burned palaces. It showed that the court could no longer contain disputes through its rituals. Military might now determine succession, and warriors held the balance of power in their hands. Those who fought with courage and loyalty received land, titles, and recognition far more quickly than generations of patient court service could provide. The precedent was dangerous, for it promised ambitious men that the sword could achieve what the pen could not. For the samurai themselves, the conflict was transformative. No longer confined to provincial skirmishes or distant frontiers, they had acted in the capital as arbiters of legitimacy. Their role in politics could no longer be denied. The court might still clothe them in titles and language of service, but it was clear who truly carried the weight of authority. The sons of Sutoku's defeated allies would grow up knowing that their family's ruin had come not from court intrigue alone, but from the blades of fellow warriors. The Hogan Rebellion was short, but its significance was vast. It announced the arrival of the warrior class as a decisive force at the center of Japanese life. It foreshadowed a century of strife in which the Minamoto and Taira would contend not only for dominance over each other, but for mastery of the empire itself. Kyoto had witnessed the first true clash of samurai armies on its soil, and the political order would never return to its earlier balance. Only 3 years after the turmoil of the Hogan Rebellion, Kyoto again found itself drowned in the noise of battle. The fragile equilibrium restored after Sutoku's exile did not last, for ambition and resentment still burned fiercely among the warriors and courtiers. In 1159, the Meiji Rebellion erupted, dragging the capital once more into the chaos of fire and steel. If Hogan had revealed that warriors could decide succession, Meiji demonstrated how swiftly fortunes could turn and how deeply the Minamoto and Taira were entwined in the empire's fate. The rebellion began with a conspiracy between Minamoto no Yoshitomo, eager to recover his clan's standing after the divided loyalties of Hogan, and Fujiwara no Nobuyori, a court official hungry for influence. Together they seized a bold opportunity. During the absence of Taira no Kiyomori, who had traveled on pilgrimage to Kumano, Yoshitomo and Nobuyori kidnapped Emperor Nijo and the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa. With the imperial household under their control, they occupied the palace and the key buildings of the capital, claiming authority in the emperor's name. At first, their plan seemed flawless. The sudden strike left their rivals stunned. Fires were set across the city, consuming residences and halls as symbols of their dominance. The smoke rose over Kyoto as a dark signal that warriors now dictated the life of the court. Minamoto's soldiers stalked the avenues, enforcing the will of their commanders, while Nobuyori issued proclamations. The alliance appeared unshakable. Yet the swiftness of their action proved also their weakness, for they had not destroyed their enemies decisively. Kiyomori returned with remarkable speed, summoning his forces and allies. The Taira swept into the capital with determination, striking at the rebel positions. Yoshitomo and Nobuyori fought with desperation, but their hold was fragile. The decisive confrontation came at the Rokuhara district, where the Taira had established their stronghold. In the clash that followed, Yoshitomo's warriors fought with courage but were overwhelmed by superior numbers and Kiyomori's tactical coordination. Flames again tore through the city, devouring entire quarters as the battle raged. Defeat for the Minamoto was catastrophic. Yoshitomo fled but was soon betrayed and killed. Most of his adult sons were executed, leaving the clan seemingly broken. Yet in an act that would shape the future of Japan, 3 young boys were spared. Yoritomo, Noriyori, and Yoshitsune, still children, were exiled to distant provinces. Their lives were preserved in part by pleas of mercy, and in part by the Buddhist notion that killing the innocent would invite misfortune. What seemed an act of leniency would in time prove Kiyomori's greatest error, for these boys would grow to become the architects of the Taira downfall. In the short term, however, the victory cemented Taira dominance. Kiyomori emerged as the preeminent power in Kyoto, his clan elevated to positions of authority and influence far surpassing those of their rivals. The Minamoto name became a shadow, its once proud houses reduced to ashes and its survivors scattered. The court, cowed by the sight of 2 rebellions within a decade, leaned ever more heavily on Taira protection. The lesson was bitter for the nobility. The emperor's authority meant little without the warriors who stood ready to enforce it. The Heiji rebellion left the capital scarred both physically and symbolically. Entire districts had burned, families had been ruined, and the fragile aura of the imperial court had been further shattered. For the common people, the sight of samurai fighting openly in the streets reinforced the truth that power lay not in titles or poetry, but in the edge of the sword and the bowstring drawn in anger. Yet beneath the Taira's triumph, seeds of future conflict were sown. The sparing of the Minamoto children created heirs who carried both a legacy of vengeance and the promise of resurgence. The memory of betrayal and fire lingered in the capital's air, ensuring that peace under the Taira would be uneasy and brief. Taira no Kiyomori's triumph after the Heiji rebellion elevated him beyond the role of mere warrior. With his rivals crushed and the Minamoto scattered, he stood as the undisputed master of Kyoto. Unlike earlier leaders who returned to their provinces after fulfilling their military obligations, Kiyomori remained in the capital. He did not merely provide military muscle, he embedded himself in the machinery of government. This decision marked a profound shift, for it blurred the line between court nobility and warrior power, fusing them into a single force centered around the Taira clan. Kiyomori began by securing high offices for himself and his relatives. Court ranks, once reserved for aristocrats who prided themselves on culture and ceremony, were filled by men hardened in battle. His sons and daughters were woven into the fabric of noble life through marriages with powerful families, including unions with the imperial household itself. Through such ties, the Taira name became inseparable from the very bloodline of emperors. No longer were warriors outsiders pressing upon the gates of authority. They sat within the palace walls, guiding policy and shaping succession. Wealth flowed into Taira coffers through their mastery of the sea. Their fleets controlled the inland sea, Japan's vital artery of commerce. From their maritime base, they managed shipping, levied tolls, and dominated trade routes that carried goods from distant provinces to the capital. Trade with Song China further enriched them, bringing silk, ceramics, and advanced goods that could be sold for immense profit. This economic power gave Kiyomori resources far beyond those of most courtiers, allowing him to fund both armies and lavish displays of generosity that reinforced his prestige. The Taira's rise was dazzling, but its brilliance masked growing cracks. By occupying positions once held by the old aristocracy, they provoked resentment among courtiers who felt displaced. Rival warrior families, too, saw themselves excluded from rewards despite their loyalty in battle. Kiyomori's determination to concentrate power within his clan left little room for allies, creating frustration that simmered beneath the surface. The Taira, once admired for their martial vigor, began to be seen as arrogant, distant, and corrupted by luxury. Signs of overreach appeared in Kiyomori's handling of imperial succession. His ambition grew so bold that he sought to place his infant grandson upon the throne, ensuring that the imperial line itself would be bound directly to his clan. To many, this act crossed an invisible line. Warriors and nobles alike murmured that the Taira had ceased to be protectors of the throne and had instead become usurpers of its sanctity. What had begun as strength now became the source of their vulnerability, for it invited opposition from all who feared the extinction of traditional order. Yet during these years of dominance, Kiyomori wielded extraordinary authority. His ability to blend warrior efficiency with courtly legitimacy allowed him to govern with a firmness unknown to the drifting politics of earlier emperors. He enforced decrees with military precision, oversaw trade and revenue, and maintained a grip on Kyoto that seemed unshakable. For a time, he was the most powerful man Japan had ever seen, a warrior who commanded not only armies, but the imperial family itself. The grandeur of Taira rule, however, carried with it the seeds of decline. As the clan basked in wealth and ceremony, their warriors lost the hard edge that had once defined them. Silk replaced armor, luxury replaced discipline, and the memory of their martial rise began to fade in the pursuit of aristocratic refinement. Their rivals watched and waited, biding their time until opportunity presented itself. Among those rivals were the surviving sons of Minamoto no Yoshitomo, spared in childhood, but growing in strength and ambition. Thus, even at the height of Kiyomori's power, the shadows of future conflict lengthened. The Taira had risen higher than any warrior clan before them, but they had done so in ways that made enemies of both nobles and fellow fighters. Their brilliance illuminated Kyoto, yet the brighter the flame, the sharper the contrast of the darkness gathering at its edge. The spark that would consume the Taira's supremacy came in 1180 when Prince Mochihito, a son of the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, issued a call to arms. Discontent with Taira dominance had reached its peak, and Mochihito urged the scattered Minamoto to rise in his name. His proclamation spread swiftly through the provinces, carried by monks and messengers, igniting hope among those who longed to break the Taira stranglehold on court and country. For the exiled sons of Minamoto no Yoshitomo, this was the signal they had awaited. The Genpei War had begun. Minamoto no Yoritomo, living under watch in the eastern provinces, seized the opportunity. Though his clan had been nearly annihilated during the Meiji Rebellion, he had grown into a cautious yet determined leader. The memory of his father's defeat and his own narrow survival gave him both patience and ambition. When word of Mochihito's summons reached him, he raised the banner of revolt in the Kanto plain. The response was immediate but uncertain. Some local families pledged support, while others hesitated, wary of the Taira's wrath. The first test came swiftly. At Ishibashiyama, Yoritomo gathered a small force, hoping to consolidate his position. Yet the Taira, moving quickly, struck before his allies could fully assemble. In the rain-soaked hills, Yoritomo's army was crushed, his men scattered, and he himself barely escaped with his life. Hunted across forests and rivers, he found refuge in the distant province of Awa. What might have ended as another failed uprising instead became the beginning of a patient and deliberate campaign. For Yoritomo understood that one defeat did not mean ruin if the dream of restoration could be kept alive. While Yoritomo struggled in the east, his brothers too were drawn into the conflict. Yoshinaka, commanding forces in Shinano, rose with his own ambitions, seeking both vengeance and personal glory. The youngest, Yoshitsune, not yet renowned, would in time emerge as one of the most brilliant commanders in Japanese history. The Minamoto cause, fractured at first, began to spread across the land, drawing in men weary of Taira arrogance and hopeful for reward under new masters. The Taira, though powerful, were burdened by overconfidence. Flush with wealth and courtly refinement, they underestimated the resilience of their enemies. Their forces were strong, but their grip on the distant provinces was loose. As rebellions spread, they found themselves stretched thin, forced to defend both the capital and the countryside. Their reliance on swift suppression proved inadequate against enemies who moved with determination and knew the terrain. For the people of Japan, the war brought hardship and devastation. Villages were plundered, fields burned, and families displaced as armies marched back and forth across the provinces. Monks joined the fighting, temples became fortresses, and trade routes turned into battlefields. The war was not confined to the halls of Kyoto, but spread into every corner of the country, drawing in peasants, priests, and warriors alike. Despite the early setback, Yoritomo's position strengthened. From his base in Kamakura, a small coastal settlement in the Kanto, he began to rebuild his following. The choice of Kamakura proved decisive. Far from Kyoto, it offered both security and a strategic location from which to command the eastern provinces. From here, he forged a new model of leadership, one not dependent on the favor of the court, but on the loyalty of his followers. He promised land and reward for service, tying warriors to his cause through practical gain rather than abstract duty. Slowly his authority grew, and the foundations of a warrior government began to take shape. The opening stages of the Genpei War revealed both the fragility of rebellion and the resilience of ambition. Though scattered and bloodied, the Minamoto refused to yield. The Taira, though wealthy and entrenched in the capital, found their dominance challenged in ways they had not anticipated. What began with a desperate call from a prince would unfold into years of battles, betrayals, and shifting fortunes, ending only when one clan was annihilated and a new order rose in its place. From the safety of Kamakura's coastal hills, Minamoto no Yoritomo began the painstaking work of transforming rebellion into structure. The eastern provinces, far from Kyoto's refined courtiers and the Taira's immediate reach, offered him both protection and opportunity. Here, the Kanto landowners, long resentful of Taira interference and eager for stability, proved willing to align themselves with a leader who spoke their language of land, loyalty, and reward. Yoritomo grasped that victory would not come from reckless charges or single battles, but from weaving together a coalition strong enough to outlast the wealth and prestige of his rivals. He cultivated his alliances through promises of tangible gain. Unlike the court, which distributed favor in the form of titles and distant recognition, Yoritomo pledged real rewards, land, security, and authority within the provinces. For warriors whose fortunes rose and fell on the productivity of their fields, such pledges held irresistible weight. Men who had hesitated to risk their lives under abstract imperial banners found purpose in fighting for a leader who offered prosperity to their families. In this way, Yoritomo built loyalty not on fleeting charisma, but on a system of mutual obligation that bound warriors to his cause. Kamakura itself became more than a refuge. It was a symbol. The town, nestled between mountains and sea, was easy to defend and far removed from Kyoto's politics. From this base, Yoritomo could communicate with his allies, plan campaigns, and project an image of independence. He surrounded himself with advisors, administrators, and seasoned warriors, establishing the beginnings of a parallel government. Orders issued from Kamakura carried the authority of military necessity, not the hollow rhetoric of the capital. Warriors who had once looked to Kyoto for recognition now turned eastward, acknowledging Yoritomo as the source of their fortunes. As his authority solidified, Yoritomo proved himself shrewd in balancing caution with decisiveness. He did not rush headlong into battles he could not win. Instead, he allowed his brothers and cousins to bear the brunt of direct confrontations, while he worked to ensure that every victory strengthened his position and every setback did not imperil his base. He understood that the war would be long, and he prepared accordingly, stockpiling resources, forging communications, and maintaining the discipline of his followers. The coalition extended beyond warriors alone. Buddhist temples, whose estates had often suffered under Taira dominance, found advantage in supporting the Minamoto. Monks provided supplies, manpower, and spiritual justification, casting the conflict not only as a struggle of power, but as a battle to restore moral balance. Even among courtiers, whispers grew louder that the Taira's arrogance had doomed them, and some offered quiet support to Yoritomo in hopes of favor should he prevail. The promises Yoritomo made were not empty words. Victories brought confiscated Taira lands, which he redistributed to his supporters. Each grant strengthened his reputation as a leader who rewarded loyalty. Unlike the court, which often delayed or diluted such rewards through endless bureaucracy, Yoritomo acted swiftly. This decisiveness built trust, ensuring that warriors remained committed even when campaigns dragged on or battles ended inconclusively. By the early stages of the Genpei War, Yoritomo's coalition had become more than a rebellion. It was the nucleus of a new political order, one centered not on the imperial throne, but on the power of a warrior leader who could command, reward, and protect. His rivals might still boast of greater wealth and immediate control of Kyoto, but Yoritomo's strength lay in the stability of his base and the loyalty of men who saw their fortunes tied directly to his success. In building this network, Yoritomo reshaped the very nature of authority in Japan. Power was no longer measured solely by proximity to the emperor or rank within courtly hierarchies. It was measured by the ability to command warriors, distribute land, and enforce justice on the ground. Kamakura stood as the symbol of this shift, a center of power rising from the provinces rather than the capital. The Genpei War was far from over, but already the lines of transformation were clear. The Taira might hold Kyoto, but the Minamoto had built something deeper, a system of loyalty and governance that could endure beyond the shifting tides of battle. Yoritomo's coalition was not merely a tool of war, it was the foundation of a new age. The Genpei War stretched across the landscape of Japan like a storm, its battles leaving behind ruins, legends, and the shaping of a new order. Among these confrontations, certain clashes revealed the true character of the conflict and the qualities that distinguished the Minamoto from their Taira rivals. It was not always sheer numbers or wealth that determined outcomes, but daring, coordination, and the willingness to exploit opportunity with speed and precision. One of the earliest turning points came at Fujikawa in 1180. After Yoritomo's initial defeat at Ishibashiyama, the Taira sought to crush him swiftly, believing the Minamoto uprising could not survive another blow. Yet Yoritomo had chosen his ground carefully. As the Taira advanced toward the Minamoto camp, their forces were unnerved by the cries of startled waterfowl rising into the night sky. In the confusion, they imagined a surprise attack had already begun. Panic spread through their ranks and order collapsed. The Minamoto seized the moment, pressing forward to rout an enemy far larger than themselves. The victory at Fujikawa did more than repel a Taira army. It convinced hesitant allies that Yoritomo's cause was viable, drawing more warriors to his banner. While Yoritomo maintained authority in the east, his cousin Minamoto no Yoshinaka advanced from Shinano. Ambitious and eager to prove his worth, Yoshinaka won a series of victories that pushed the Taira from central Japan. In 1183 he marched into Kyoto as a liberator, welcomed by a court desperate to be free of Taira dominance. For a brief moment it seemed Yoshinaka might eclipse even Yoritomo. Yet his rough manner, indiscipline among his soldiers, and arrogance toward the court quickly eroded support. His presence in the capital, rather than stabilizing it, became a source of unease. It was in response to Yoshinaka's excesses that Minamoto no Yoshitsune entered the stage. Younger brother to Yoritomo, Yoshitsune had grown up in exile, shaped by hardship and sharpened by a restless brilliance. Unlike Yoritomo's measured caution, Yoshitsune embodied audacity. In 1184 he confronted Yoshinaka at the Battle of Owazu. Despite Yoshinaka's skill, Yoshitsune outmaneuvered him, and the once promising cousin was slain in retreat. The Minamoto house, fractured by rivalry, was thus unified under Yoritomo's leadership, though it was Yoshitsune's daring that made unity possible. The legend of Yoshitsune only deepened in the battles that followed. That same year, he commanded forces at the Battle of Ichi no Tani, where the Taira held a fortress pressed against the sea and the mountains. Conventional assault seemed impossible, but Yoshitsune conceived a plan both reckless and ingenious. Leading a small detachment through treacherous mountain passes, he descended upon the fortress from a cliff the enemy believed impassable. The sudden attack threw the Taira into chaos, and the fortress fell. The spectacle of cavalry descending a near-vertical slope etched Yoshitsune's name into the chronicles of Japanese warfare. In 1185, Yoshitsune struck again at the Battle of Yashima. The Taira, retreating with the young Emperor Antoku, fortified themselves on an island base. Under cover of darkness and with a carefully planned deception, Yoshitsune launched a surprise amphibious assault, forcing the Taira into flight. The victory demonstrated not only military cunning, but psychological mastery, for the Taira were left shaken and vulnerable, their aura of invincibility shattered. These victories were more than battlefield triumphs. They revealed the contrast between the two great clans. The Taira, rooted in the capital and burdened by wealth and ceremony, often moved cautiously, relying on numbers and established positions. The Minamoto, hardened by exile and driven by vengeance, relied on daring and flexibility. Yoshitsune, in particular, embodied the spirit of adaptation, striking where least expected and exploiting both terrain and psychology to overwhelm larger foes. The tide of the war had turned decisively. The Taira, once unassailable masters of Kyoto, now found themselves retreating further westward, clinging so to their control of the inland sea. Their fleet still gave them mobility, but on land their strength dwindled. Meanwhile, the Minamoto gained momentum with each victory, their coalition strengthened by the promise of reward and the example of bold leadership. Yet even amid triumph, seeds of tension lay within the Minamoto camp. Yoritomo, watching from Kamakura, viewed his brother's fame with suspicion. Yoshitsune's victories inspired songs and admiration across the provinces, threatening to overshadow Yoritomo's carefully constructed authority. Though the war was not yet finished, the rivalry between these two brothers foreshadowed new conflicts to come once the Taira had been dealt with. For the moment, however, the Minamoto advance seemed unstoppable. The final confrontation loomed on the waters of the inland sea, where the Taira would make their last stand. The Genpei War, born in ambushes and palace fires, was approaching its climactic end in a battle that would determine the fate of the empire. The year 1185 brought the Genpei War to its final and most dramatic moment. After years of retreat and loss, the Taira gathered their remaining strength for a decisive confrontation at sea. Their fleet, carrying the child emperor Antoku and the imperial regalia, sailed into the straits of Dan-no-ura, where the narrow waters of the inland sea met the open ocean. There, on a morning in April, the fate of two clans and the future of Japan would be decided. The Taira chose the battlefield carefully. Their mastery of the sea had long been their advantage, and they hoped that a naval engagement would restore their fortunes. Hundreds of ships lined the straits, oars cutting through the current as banners flapped in the spring wind. Warriors stood armored and armed on the decks, while nobles and attendants clustered around the young emperor, only 8 years old, who represented the last fragile symbol of their legitimacy. The regalia, the sword, the mirror, and the jewel were with him, as if the very soul of the empire floated upon the waves. Across the waters, the Minamoto fleet approached, under the command of Yoshitsune. His reputation for daring was already legend, and his men looked to him for victory. Unlike the Taira, who still clung to their old grandeur, the Minamoto fought with the hunger of survivors determined to end generations of humiliation. The straits became a stage upon which resolve, cunning, and desperation collided. The battle began with volleys of arrows blackening the sky as each side sought to weaken the other from a distance. The thunder of bowstrings and the splash of arrows striking water filled the air. Then ships closed, grappling one another so that warriors could leap across decks, swords and spears flashing in brutal combat. The straits echoed with the cries of the wounded and the crash of timber as vessels collided. At first, the Taira seemed to hold an advantage. They knew the tides and currents, and their positioning allowed them to hem in parts of the Minamoto fleet. But Yoshitsune, ever alert, shifted his tactics. Instead of matching strength to strength, he targeted the enemy's command. Orders carried across the Taira ranks relied on the coordination of key vessels, and by striking these, Yoshitsune sowed confusion. Then came the decisive betrayal. A Taira commander, swayed by promises or resentments, revealed the ship carrying the emperor. With their secret exposed, the Taira found themselves vulnerable in the heart of their line. As the tide turned, both literally and metaphorically, the Minamoto pressed the attack. The current shifted against the Taira, driving their ships into disarray. Surrounded and overwhelmed, their resistance collapsed into chaos. Some warriors fought to the death on the decks, others leapt into the sea, preferring to drown with honor rather than fall to enemy blades. Mothers clasped children to their chests as they disappeared beneath the waves, choosing death over capture. The most tragic moment came when the young Emperor Antoku was carried to the side of the ship by his grandmother, Taira no Tokiko. Knowing that capture would mean humiliation and the loss of legitimacy for the clan, she leapt into the sea with him in her arms. The child emperor vanished beneath the waters, taking with him the hopes of the Taira. The imperial regalia, too, were cast into the depths. One was lost forever, another recovered only later. The symbolism was devastating. The divine essence of rulership itself had sunk into the straits, severing the Taira from both throne and destiny. By the day's end, the Taira clan was annihilated. Their leaders were dead, their fleet destroyed, their lineage broken. Survivors were few, and those captured faced execution or exile. What had begun decades earlier as a slow rise through trade and courtly marriage ended in the waves of Dan-no-ura, where arrogance and overreach met the ruthless resolve of their enemies. For the Minamoto, the victory was absolute. The clan that had once been driven into exile and near extinction now stood supreme. Yet the triumph carried both glory and burden. They had destroyed their rivals, but in doing so they inherited the weight of governing a fractured land. The Genpei War was finished, but its conclusion marked only the beginning of a new struggle: how to transform military supremacy into enduring political order. In the silence that followed the carnage, the waters of the straits flowed on, concealing beneath them the bones of warriors, nobles, and an emperor. The Battle of Dan-no-ura was not only the end of the Taira, but a moment that imprinted itself upon the memory of Japan, a tale of loyalty, betrayal, tragedy, and the inexorable rise of the samurai. With the waves of Dan-no-ura still echoing in memory, Minamoto no Yoritomo faced the task of transforming victory into permanence. Triumph in war could topple rivals, but the challenge of ruling an entire country demanded something more enduring than arrows and swords. For centuries, power had been claimed through the authority of the imperial court, but Yoritomo understood that the court alone could no longer command loyalty or enforce order. What Japan required was a new system, one that recognized the strength of the warrior class and placed governance firmly in their hands. Yoritomo did not rush to Kyoto in the flush of victory. Instead, he remained in Kamakura, a deliberate choice that signaled independence from the court's ceremonial world. Kamakura, hemmed in by mountains and sea, was not a glittering capital, but a fortress of stability. From this base, Yoritomo could watch the court from a distance, while building institutions that suited the needs of warriors rather than aristocrats. This restraint revealed his genius. He sought not to bask in the prestige of the capital, but to create a government that could outlast the cycles of intrigue that had doomed earlier families. In 1192, after the death of Go-Shirakawa, Yoritomo was formally appointed Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo. The title itself was ancient, once used for commanders sent against northern tribes, but under Yoritomo it acquired an entirely new meaning. No longer was it a temporary designation for a campaign, it became the foundation of a parallel government. The shogun held authority not because of court ceremony, but because warriors across the land recognized his leadership. In this moment, the Kamakura shogunate was born. At the heart of this new order stood the bakufu, literally tent government, a term that evoked the military camp but now described the entire apparatus of administration. Yoritomo established offices to oversee land disputes, tax collection, and appointments of local stewards known as jito. These stewards were responsible for managing estates, ensuring that revenues reached Kamakura, and maintaining order. They were balanced by shugo, or provincial governors, who supervised broader regions and enforced security. This dual system created a structure where loyalty was directed not toward the distant court, but toward the shogunate, binding warriors to the new order with tangible duties and rewards. Yoritomo's reforms were pragmatic rather than ideological. He recognized that warriors cared most about land, inheritance, and security. The bakufu offered mechanisms for resolving disputes that had often erupted into violence, granting warriors confidence that their claims would be recognized. By securing rights of inheritance for vassals and their families, he tied loyalty across generations, ensuring that allegiance to the Minamoto line would persist beyond any single lifetime. This stability distinguished his rule from the fleeting dominance of the Taira. Yet the structure was not without fragility. Yoritomo's control over the provinces depended on the personal loyalty of men who had fought beside him. Their allegiance was strong while he lived, but the question of succession loomed. After his death in 1199, the weight of governance fell upon his descendants, whose youth and inexperience left them vulnerable. Into this vacuum stepped the Hojo family, maternal relatives of Yoritomo, who maneuvered to assume the role of regents. Through careful manipulation, they reduced the shogun to a symbolic figurehead, wielding real power themselves. Thus, even within the new order, the cycle of ambition and usurpation continued, though the framework Yoritomo had created endured. The assassination of Yoritomo's son, Yorie, underscored this fragility. factionalism within the Minamoto family invited intrigue and betrayal, reminding all that warrior politics remained dangerous even under the guise of stability. Yet the shogunate survived, adapting to these crises through the regency system. What mattered was not the individual at the top, but the continuity of institutions that allowed warriors to secure their livelihoods and maintain order. By founding the Kamakura shogunate, Yoritomo achieved something unprecedented. He institutionalized the power of the samurai. No longer would they be mere instruments of courtiers or opportunistic rebels. They had become the governing class, their authority codified in offices and backed by the loyalty of a country that had grown weary of aristocratic neglect. The court in Kyoto remained, its ceremonies intact, but it was now a shadow beside the real machinery of rule. The Genpei War had ended with the destruction of the Taira, but its true consequence was the birth of a new political order. From Kamakura, far from the gilded avenues of Kyoto, the samurai would shape Japan for centuries to come. As the Kamakura shogunate settled into its role as the seat of warrior government, the need for a coherent legal structure became increasingly urgent. The old codes of the court, steeped in Chinese models and refined in the world of aristocrats, were ill-suited to the realities of provincial disputes. Warriors did not seek elaborate ritual or precedent drawn from distant philosophies. They required practical solutions to conflicts over land, inheritance, and service. The absence of such clarity threatened to unravel the loyalty Yoritomo had so carefully cultivated. Out of this need emerged the Jōi Shikimoku, a legal code that reflected the pragmatic spirit of the samurai. Promulgated in 1232, decades after Yoritomo's death, the code was established under the regency of the Hojo family, who had assumed control of the shogunate after the extinction of the Minamoto line. It bore the name of the era, Jōi, and was sometimes called the Formulary of Adjudications. Its purpose was not to create lofty declarations, but to provide guidelines that could be applied swiftly and consistently by officials across the provinces. In this way, the law became a tool for preserving order among a class whose strength lay in arms, but whose stability depended on restraint. The Jōi Shikimoku focused above all on land. Ownership and inheritance were the lifeblood of the warrior class, the foundation of loyalty and the source of wealth. The code provided rules for resolving disputes over boundaries, clarifying inheritance rights, and adjudicating claims between families. It acknowledged that warriors required certainty if they were to remain loyal, for without assurance that their holdings would pass safely to their descendants, promises of service would ring hollow. By institutionalizing these guarantees, the shogunate bound its vassals more tightly to its authority. Beyond land, the code addressed behavior and conduct. It emphasized honesty in dealings, moderation in judgment, and fairness in distribution of rewards. While not couched in lofty moral terms, it carried an implicit expectation of integrity. Warriors were to act with discipline, avoid unnecessary cruelty, and remain faithful to their obligations. These prescriptions reflected not abstract ideals, but the lived experience of men who knew that unchecked violence or dishonor could tear apart the fragile bonds holding their society together. The Jōi Shikimoku also revealed a blend of influences. Buddhist notions of karma and responsibility colored some provisions, while Confucian ideals of hierarchy and duty echoed in its emphasis on loyalty to superiors. Yet its heart was distinctly Japanese, born of the conditions of a society where fields and swords determined survival. It stood as a rejection of aristocratic codes that prized form over function, replacing them with laws rooted in the needs of men who lived close to the soil and far from Kyoto's ceremonial world. Importantly, the code was not rigid. It was intended as a guide rather than an unyielding statute, allowing flexibility for judges to adapt rulings to circumstances. This adaptability ensured its longevity for it could be applied across diverse provinces and shifting situations. In many cases, disputes were resolved not by abstract legal principle, but by appealing to a sense of fairness grounded in custom and warrior ethos. In this way, the code mirrored the very character of the samurai, practical, adaptable, and bound by duty rather than ornament. The promulgation of the Jōi Shikimoku strengthened the authority of the shogunate in profound ways. It demonstrated that warrior rule was not merely a matter of force, but of governance. By providing justice, the Bakufu showed that it could serve not only its vassals, but the country at large. In doing so, it secured a legitimacy that swords alone could not provide. Warriors who once fought only for personal advancement now saw themselves as part of an order upheld by law, their service grounded in something larger than individual ambition. Through the Jōi Shikimoku, the samurai class took another step toward defining itself as a ruling order. The law reflected their concerns, protected their interests, and articulated their values. It was a code for men who tilled and defended the land, for families who sought continuity, and for a society that had embraced the warrior as its guardian. Its legacy would endure for centuries, a testament to the transformation of Japan from courtly aristocracy to military governance. In the autumn of 1274, dark sails appeared on the horizon of Hakata Bay. For the first time in memory, Japan faced an enemy not of its own blood, not a rival clan or rebel band, but a foreign empire of staggering size and ambition. The Mongols, who had swept across Asia with relentless speed, now turned their gaze toward the islands across the sea. Under the rule of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, they demanded Japan's submission as vassal. The Kamakura shogunate, guided by the Hojo regents, refused. What followed was a trial by fire that would test both the resolve of the samurai and the very foundations of their society. The first Mongol invasion was unlike any conflict the warriors of Japan had known. The Mongols brought with them not only their own seasoned horsemen, but also conscripts and sailors from Korea and China, forming a coalition fleet of hundreds of ships. Their numbers dwarfed anything Japan could muster, and their methods of war struck terror into defenders unaccustomed to such scale. When their forces landed at Hakata Bay, the clash between two martial traditions erupted with devastating force. Samurai were trained to fight in single combat, announcing their names and seeking glory in personal duels. Mongol warfare allowed no such ceremony. Their archers loosed volleys of arrows in coordinated ranks, drumming the ground with relentless rhythm. Explosive bombs filled with gunpowder and iron burst among the Japanese defenders, a thunder and fire unknown on their battlefields. The air shook with the beating of drums and horns, meant to coordinate movements and unnerve the enemy. For the samurai, accustomed to silence broken only by cries of challenge, the noise and fury were overwhelming. The initial battles were grim. Many Japanese fell, pierced by arrows or scattered by explosions. Horses panicked at the sound of thunderbombs throwing riders into confusion. Yet the warriors of Japan did not yield. They fought with the ferocity of men defending their homeland, hurling themselves into melee even against overwhelming odds. Sword against spear, spear against shield, they sought to close the distance where personal valor could still turn the tide. Despite their shock tactics, the Mongols faced difficulties of their own. The rugged coastline of Hakata Bay limited their ability to maneuver, and Japanese counterattacks harried their flanks. Night fell with neither side claiming total victory. The Mongols withdrew to their ships, intending to renew the assault at dawn, but fate intervened. A sudden storm swept across the bay, scattering the fleet and smashing ships upon rocks. Many drowned, their armor dragging them beneath the waves. Others limped back to Korea, battered and demoralized. Japan had been spared, not by decisive battlefield triumph, but by the caprice of wind and water. For For the samurai, the invasion was both a shock and a revelation. They had faced an enemy whose methods defied their traditions, and though survival owed much to the storm, the defenders recognized the need for change. No longer could warfare be confined to rituals of single combat. Massed defense, coordination, and preparation were essential. The Mongol threat had exposed vulnerabilities in the warrior class, even as it reinforced their resolve to adapt. In the years that followed, the shogunate took measures to fortify the coast. Stone walls were raised along Hakata Bay, stretching for kilometers, designed to prevent future landings. Watch posts were established, and warriors were rotated for garrison duty. The memory of fire and thunder haunted the nation, reminding all that the Mongols had not been defeated, only delayed. The sense of reprieve carried with it both relief and anxiety, for everyone knew the empire across the sea would not so easily abandon its ambitions. The invasion of 1274 was more than an isolated battle. It was a crucible that tested the samurai against a world beyond Japan, a world of empires and armies that dwarfed their own. It revealed both their courage and their limitations, and it foreshadowed trials yet to come. The warriors of Japan had stood firm, but they sensed that the storm had given them borrowed time rather than final victory. In the summer of 1281, the Mongols returned, this time with an armada the likes of which Japan had never imagined. The first invasion had been but a probe compared to what now sailed across the sea. Kublai Khan, determined to avenge the humiliation of failure and to compel Japan into submission, assembled two massive fleets. One sailed from Korea, the other from southern China, converging upon Kyushu in a storm of sails and soldiers. Contemporary accounts speak of more than 4,000 ships and over 100,000 men, an invasion force larger than any Japan had ever faced. The defenders were not unprepared. After the shock of 1274, the Kamakura shogunate had poured effort into strengthening coastal defenses. Along Hakata Bay, stone walls rose nearly 2 meters high, their bases sunk deep to resist erosion and assault. Watchtowers dotted the coastline, and warriors were stationed in rotations to keep vigilance day and night. These preparations reflected not only fear, but a new understanding. The samurai could no longer rely solely on individual duels and mounted charges. They had to stand together in coordinated defense, ready to resist an enemy who fought with numbers, discipline, and strange new weapons. When the Mongol fleets arrived, the scale of the threat was staggering. Their ships darkened the horizon, spreading across the waters like an iron tide. Drums thundered, signaling coordinated movements, while arrows and stones rained from siege engines mounted on decks. Yet the walls along Hakata Bay blunted their landings. Samurai lined the ramparts, loosing arrows and hurling stones of their own, repelling attempts to storm the shore. Unable to break through easily, the invaders sought anchorage offshore, intending to wear down the defenders over time. The Japanese did not wait passively. Small groups of warriors launched night raids in nimble boats, rowing out under the cover of darkness, to set fire to enemy ships and cut down guards before slipping away. These tactics sowed fear and disruption in the massive fleet, forcing the Mongols to remain constantly alert. Though the defenders could not match the invaders ship for ship, their audacity prevented the Mongols from settling into security. For weeks the stalemate dragged on, the invaders unable to force a decisive landing, the defenders unable to drive them completely away. Disease began to spread among the crowded ships, and supplies dwindled. The Chinese fleet, delayed in arrival, struggled to coordinate with the Korean contingent, and tensions grew within the Allied force. Yet even so, the Mongols remained a formidable threat, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm Japan if fortune favored them. Then came the storm. In August, a typhoon swept across Kyushu, descending with catastrophic force upon the anchored Mongol fleet. Winds howled, waves rose like mountains, and ships crashed against one another, or splintered upon unseen rocks. Contemporary accounts describe the sea littered with broken hulls and bodies, the waters running red with the blood of drowning soldiers. Entire squadrons vanished beneath the waves, undone not by Japanese blades, but by the fury of nature. For the defenders watching from the shore, the sight was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. What they could not achieve with arrows and swords, the storm had accomplished in a single night. The survivors attempted to regroup, but their forces were shattered, their morale destroyed. Those who staggered onto the beaches were cut down by waiting samurai, and soon the remnants fled back across the sea. The memory of this storm would live forever in Japanese consciousness as the kamikaze, the divine wind. To the warriors and peasants alike, it seemed as if the gods themselves had intervened to preserve the nation. Temples rang with prayers of thanksgiving, and the belief grew that Japan was shielded by divine favor, set apart from the fate of other lands conquered by the Mongol Empire. Yet the victory carried hidden costs. The shogunate had mobilized thousands of warriors, kept them on guard for months, and built extensive fortifications. After the invasion's collapse, there were no new lands to distribute, no spoils to reward loyal service. Warriors who had sacrificed much expected compensation, and when it did not come, discontent spread. The very storm that preserved Japan also deepened strains within the Kamakura system, for it revealed how difficult it was to maintain loyalty without conquest and reward. The second Mongol invasion thus ended not only in disaster for the invaders, but also in quiet unease for the victors. Japan remained free, its warriors vindicated in their courage, and its people convinced of divine protection. But beneath the surface, the cost of survival weighed heavily, and the seeds of future turmoil had already been sown. The decades following the great storms of 1274 and 1281 left Japan both triumphant and uneasy. The Mongol threat had been turned back, and the nation celebrated what seemed divine protection. Yet the Kamakura shogunate, governed by the Hojo regents, found itself strained in ways less visible than burning ships or fallen warriors. The cost of mobilization, fortification, and long months of vigilance had been staggering. Unlike the victories of the Genpei War, the Mongol invasions yielded no new land, no estates to parcel out to loyal retainers. Warriors who had sacrificed time, wealth, and blood returned home with little more than gratitude. Gratitude, however, could not sustain loyalty. The problem was structural. The samurai class had been built upon a system of mutual obligation, service rewarded by land or privilege. Without spoils of conquest, the shogunate relied instead on symbolic rewards, letters of commendation, and promises of favor. For many warriors, these proved inadequate. Frustration simmered, especially among those who had risked their lives on the front lines of Hakata Bay. Some began to question whether the regents in Kamakura understood or valued the burdens borne by their followers. Meanwhile, the costs of defense had not ended with the invasions. The stone walls along Kyushu required maintenance, garrisons had to be rotated, and watch was kept against the possibility of a third assault. The financial strain deepened. Villages and temples were pressed for resources, further feeding resentment. The divine wind had preserved Japan from conquest, but it had left behind an economic storm that slowly eroded the foundations of Hojo authority. The imperial court, long overshadowed by the shogunate, sensed opportunity in this discontent. Emperor Go-Daigo, who ascended the throne in the early 14th century, harbored ambitions unlike those of his more passive predecessors. He sought to restore direct imperial rule, dismantling the power of the Hojo regents. To achieve this, he cultivated alliances among dissatisfied warriors and courtiers who longed to reclaim influence lost to Kamakura. His charisma and vision stirred hope that the balance of power could shift once more. The Hojo, wary of these ambitions, kept close watch on the emperor. Yet Go-Daigo proved both patient and cunning. He cultivated secret supporters across the provinces, laying the groundwork for resistance. When open conflict finally erupted in the 1330s, it was known as the Genko War. This struggle was not a foreign invasion, but a civil upheaval born from years of frustration, ambition, and structural weakness within the shogunate. At the heart of the Genko War lay the question of legitimacy. The Hojo regents ruled in the name of shoguns who were often young or symbolic, exercising authority without the bloodline to claim it. The emperor, by contrast, embodied centuries of sacred lineage, even if his practical power had waned. Go-Daigo's call to arms resonated with warriors weary of Kamakura's distant commands. His promise of restored imperial governance offered both a return to tradition and the possibility of new rewards for those who supported him. The early campaigns of the Genko War exposed the fragility of Hojo control. Provincial families wavered in their loyalty, some abandoning the shogunate when imperial forces gained momentum. Battles flared across central Japan, with castles besieged and provinces shifting allegiance. The Hojo regents fought fiercely to maintain their authority, but cracks widened in their coalition. Even the memory of past victories against the Mongols could not mask the reality of a government losing the confidence of its warriors. By the mid-1330s, the once mighty Kamakura shogunate stood on the edge of collapse. Its inability to reward service after the Mongol invasions had drained its legitimacy, while the emperor's defiance gave voice to long-suppressed discontent. The same samurai class that the Hojo had once united under practical law and military strength now splintered, lured by promises of change and glory under a different banner. The decline of Kamakura revealed a truth as old as the warrior class itself. Loyalty was bound not only by honor, but by land, reward, and purpose. When these bonds frayed, no system, however well crafted, could endure. The age of the Hojo regents was drawing to a close, and with it the first experiment in warrior governance. Ahead lay new turbulence as Japan once again entered a cycle of rebellion, restoration, and shifting power. The fall of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333 was swift and brutal, a collapse accelerated by years of discontent and the bold defiance of Emperor Go-Daigo. For the first time in centuries, the imperial court sought to reclaim direct rule over Japan. This brief but dramatic experiment, remembered as the Meiji Restoration, represented both the highest hopes of the throne and the fatal weaknesses of attempting to govern without the samurai's practical support. Go-Daigo was not a passive figurehead. Unlike emperors content to let regents or shoguns wield true authority, he envisioned a revival of imperial power in its purest form. He saw himself as the rightful master of Japan, destined to end the dominance of warriors who had overshadowed the court since the rise of the Minamoto. His determination was clear when he refused to accept the puppet role assigned by the Hojo regents, instead rallying loyalists across the provinces. Arrested and exiled to the Oki Islands, he escaped in 1333 and raised the banner of resistance once more. His escape transformed him from a restrained monarch into a symbol of defiance. Among those who rallied to his cause was Kusunoki Masashige, a provincial warrior of remarkable skill and loyalty. Kusunoki became the embodiment of devotion to the emperor, a strategist whose cunning turned small forces into formidable obstacles. He employed guerrilla tactics, fortifying mountain strongholds and harassing superior Hojo armies until they fractured. His blend of tactical brilliance and unshakable fidelity made him legendary. Even centuries later, his name would be remembered as the model of samurai loyalty, a man who placed duty to his sovereign above personal survival. The Hojo, already weakened by financial strain and faltering support, could not withstand the momentum building against them. Ashikaga Takauji, a general of Minamoto descent entrusted with suppressing Go-Daigo's rebellion, defected in a move that changed the balance of power. Instead of crushing the emperor's cause, he turned his forces against the Hojo, seizing Kyoto for the throne. In Kamakura, another loyalist, Nita Yoshisada, stormed the Hojo stronghold. The final battle was devastating. Kamakura was sacked, and the Hojo regents annihilated, many committing suicide to avoid capture. The first shogunate of Japan, which had endured since Yoritomo's day, ended in fire and blood. With the Hojo destroyed, Go-Daigo reclaimed the throne in triumph. The Kenmu Restoration seemed to promise a new era, where the imperial house once again governed directly. Lands confiscated from the Hojo were redistributed, offices were restructured, and the emperor sought to place loyal courtiers and select warriors in positions of authority. For a brief moment, the ancient vision of centralized rule seemed reborn. Yet cracks quickly appeared. Go-Daigo's reforms favored the old nobility more than the warriors who had fought to restore him. Samurai expected land and titles in return for their sacrifices, but many found themselves overlooked in favor of courtiers with little connection to the battlefield. Resentment spread, particularly among men like Ashikaga Takauji, who believed his decisive role in toppling the Hojo deserved greater reward. Go-Daigo, holding tightly to imperial supremacy, underestimated the depth of this dissatisfaction. The rift widened as Takauji began to act independently. When unrest broke out in the provinces, he responded with his own authority, claiming he acted in the name of stability. His power base grew, drawing warriors disillusioned with the emperor's favoritism. By 1336, tensions had erupted into open conflict. Takauji, once the emperor's champion, marched against Kyoto, setting the stage for yet another transformation of Japan's political order. For Kusunoki Masashige, the crisis was tragic. Loyal to the emperor to the very end, he urged Go-Daigo to compromise with Takauji to preserve the throne, even if it meant sacrifice. Go-Daigo refused, driven by his vision of absolute restoration. Obedient to his sovereign, Kusunoki led imperial forces at the Battle of Minamoto, where he and his men were overwhelmed. Choosing loyalty over life, he died with the emperor's banner still raised, cementing his place in history as the paragon of fidelity. The Kenmu Restoration ended almost as quickly as it began. What had promised renewal dissolved into civil war, splitting the land between imperial loyalists and Takauji's growing faction. Yet even in failure, the episode revealed the enduring tension at the heart of Japanese politics, the sacred authority of the emperor versus the practical power of the samurai. For a brief, shining moment, the throne had grasped real control. Its loss only underscored how deeply the warrior class had reshaped the destiny of Japan. The collapse of the Kenmu Restoration plunged Japan into one of its most turbulent eras, remembered as the time of the northern and southern courts. The rift between Emperor Go-Daigo and Ashikaga Takauji did not merely end a political experiment, it split the very heart of imperial legitimacy. For half a century, Japan lived under two competing courts, each claiming to embody the true authority of the throne. After his defeat in Kyoto, Go-Daigo refused to accept loss. Retreating to Yoshino in the mountains south of the capital, he established what came to be called the Southern Court. There he continued to hold the imperial regalia and asserted that his line was the only rightful ruler of Japan. His court was smaller, poorer, and often on the defensive, yet it carried the aura of legitimacy, for the sacred treasures and the unbroken imperial line remained in his possession. In Kyoto, Ashikaga Takauji installed a rival emperor, drawing upon a branch of the imperial family willing to cooperate. This northern court, though lacking the regalia, enjoyed the protection of Takauji's armies and the resources of the capital. For many warriors, loyalty to this court was less about conviction than about necessity. The Ashikaga provided rewards, titles, and land. tangible incentives that the beleaguered southern court could rarely match. The schism was not merely symbolic. It plunged the land into decades of intermittent warfare, sieges, and shifting alliances. Families were torn between loyalty to the southern court's sacred legitimacy and the northern court's practical power. Castles rose across the provinces not only as defenses against external enemies, but as centers of fractured authority. The landscape of Japan became a patchwork of shifting allegiances, with warriors weighing honor, survival, and reward in each choice they made. The Ashikaga shogunate, founded in the midst of this turmoil, marked a new phase of warrior government. Takauji's decision to seize power had been born of ambition and frustration, yet he was forced to justify his rule in a world still bound to the mystique of the imperial line. By maintaining a compliant northern court in Kyoto, he cloaked his authority in a semblance of legitimacy even as he wielded power with military might. The arrangement reflected the dual nature of Japanese politics, the emperor as sacred symbol, the shogun as practical ruler. For the southern court, survival depended on resilience and the loyalty of a handful of steadfast families. Kusunoki Masashige's descendants continued his legacy of devotion even as resources dwindled. Raids and small campaigns kept their cause alive, but the weight of the Ashikaga's resources gradually tilted the balance. Over time, even sympathetic warriors drifted toward Kyoto, seeking rewards and stability rather than endless struggle in the mountains. The conflict also reshaped the very character of warfare. No longer confined to decisive battles like those of the Genpei War, the struggle became one of attrition. Castles and fortified strongholds multiplied, and warfare became a matter of sieges, raids, and shifting local control. The emphasis on fortification and endurance foreshadowed the castle-centered warfare that would dominate Japan in later centuries. Despite the chaos, culture continued to flourish. The Ashikaga, seeking to distinguish their rule, became patrons of the arts, fostering the growth of Zen aesthetics, ink painting, and garden design. Even as warriors clashed on battlefields, temples and palaces echoed with new expressions of beauty shaped by Zen discipline and simplicity. This paradox, violence alongside cultural refinement, became a hallmark of the age. By the mid-14th century, the southern court's cause had begun to fade. Without the ability to secure broad warrior support, its struggle remained symbolic rather than decisive. Eventually, in the late 1300s, the two courts would reconcile, with the imperial line in Kyoto restored as the sole recognized authority. Yet the episode left deep scars, a reminder of how fragile legitimacy could be when separated from practical power. The northern and southern courts period revealed the enduring tension that defined medieval Japan. The emperor's authority, rooted in sacred tradition, could inspire loyalty but could not secure victory without the support of warriors. The shogun's power, grounded in military might, could command obedience but remained vulnerable without the appearance of legitimacy. Between these poles, Japan would continue to oscillate, forging a history marked by both conflict and adaptation. By the late 14th century, the turbulence of the northern and southern courts began to subside, and the Ashikaga shogunate emerged with renewed strength. At the center of this resurgence stood Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, whose rule from 1368 to 1394 marked the height of Ashikaga authority. Yoshimitsu was more than a military leader. He was a statesman, diplomat, and patron of culture, who sought to reconcile the contradictions of warrior governance and imperial tradition. Under his leadership, Kyoto glittered once more, even as the structural tensions of samurai politics lingered beneath the surface. Yoshimitsu's first task was to heal the rift of the divided courts. Decades of civil strife had drained both the northern and southern factions, leaving the country weary of endless conflict. Through a combination of negotiation and pressure, Yoshimitsu engineered a compromise in 1392. The southern court relinquished its claim, and the imperial line was unified in Kyoto under northern court authority. Though this settlement favored the Ashikaga and their chosen imperial branch, it brought a measure of stability to a country long divided. For the first time in generations, Japan was no longer torn between two emperors. With political reconciliation achieved, Yoshimitsu turned to consolidating his own power. He worked to bind the court aristocracy and the warrior class together under his patronage. He assumed courtly titles, dressed in refined robes, and even built palaces that rivaled those of the emperor himself. At the same time, he rewarded loyal samurai with land and authority, ensuring that his government retained the support of the military. By mastering both the language of the court and the pragmatism of the warrior, Yoshimitsu positioned himself as the indispensable bridge between two worlds. Diplomacy also played a vital role in his vision. In 1401, Yoshimitsu sent a mission to China, opening formal relations with the Ming dynasty. For the first time, Japan engaged in tributary trade with its powerful continental neighbor. While the arrangement symbolically acknowledged Chinese supremacy, in practice it enriched Japan through the flow of silk, porcelain, and luxury goods. For Yoshimitsu, diplomacy was less about submission and more about weaving Japan into a network of exchange that bolstered his prestige. Culturally, his era shone with brilliance. Yoshimitsu patronized the arts of Zen Buddhism, which flourished under his guidance. Ink painting, no theater, and the design of temple gardens reached new heights, blending simplicity with elegance. He oversaw the construction of the Golden Pavilion, Kinkakuji, a shimmering temple whose reflection upon its pond symbolized the harmony of nature and art. This patronage gave the Ashikaga shogunate a legacy beyond war, one that tied its name to enduring achievements of Japanese culture. Yet beneath this radiance, tensions persisted. Yoshimitsu's accumulation of courtly titles and privileges stirred unease, for it seemed he sought to eclipse the emperor himself. His blending of imperial and military authority created a fragile balance, one dependent on his unique charisma and vision. After his death in 1408, successors would struggle to maintain the same degree of control. Without his unifying presence, the shogunate would find itself vulnerable to the same fractures that had undone earlier regimes. For the samurai, the age of Yoshimitsu was one of opportunity, but also of growing restlessness. Warriors served both as military guardians and as administrators, but their loyalty was bound by land and reward, not by cultural refinements. As resources became contested and rivalries sharpened, the very class that had elevated the Ashikaga could just as easily unravel their power. The glittering achievements of the Golden Pavilion and the art's master structure that, while impressive, lacked the firmness to endure unchecked. Yoshimitsu's legacy was thus double-edged. He brought peace, unity, and cultural brilliance, elevating the Ashikaga shogunate to heights it had never before known. But he also revealed how precarious such grandeur could be, resting on the shoulders of one extraordinary leader. After him, the balance between emperor, shogun, and samurai would prove increasingly difficult to sustain, and the cracks of future discord began to widen. The 15th century brought the Ashikaga shogunate from its dazzling heights into an era of decline. The brilliance of Yoshimitsu's age could not conceal the structural weaknesses of the regime. Authority in Japan had always been fragile, balanced between the sacred aura of the emperor, the practical might of the shogun, and the ambitions of provincial warriors. Without Yoshimitsu's unifying charisma, the Ashikaga struggled to hold these elements together. What followed was a slow unraveling that culminated in the Onin War, a conflict so destructive that it ushered in the century of turmoil known as the Sengoku period. After Yoshimitsu's death, his successors lacked both his political skill and his aura of legitimacy. Ashikaga, Yoshimochi, Yoshikazu, and later Yoshinori each attempted to assert control, but their authority was increasingly challenged by powerful regional lords, the daimyo. These provincial magnates, entrusted with land and military power, began to act with growing independence. Though they nominally owed loyalty to the shogunate, in practice their allegiance was dictated by local strength and opportunity. By the mid-15th century, the Ashikaga shogunate was beset by factionalism within Kyoto itself. Succession disputes among the shoguns weakened central authority, while court nobles and warrior families maneuvered for advantage. The capital, once revitalized by Yoshimitsu, became a battleground of intrigue. Rival clans such as the Hosokawa, Yamana, Hatakeyama, and Shiba grew powerful, their private armies rivaling or even exceeding those loyal to the shogun. The shogunate, intended to impose order, became instead the stage upon which disorder multiplied. The crisis erupted in 1467 with the outbreak of the Onin War. Ostensibly a conflict over succession to the position of shogun and the inheritance of key clans, it soon spiraled into a decade-long struggle that devastated Kyoto and fractured the nation. The war began when Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the shogun of the time, failed to produce a clear heir. Rival factions coalesced around competing candidates, drawing in the Hosokawa and Yamana clans as leaders of opposing sides. What might have remained a court dispute expanded into a nationwide conflagration. Kyoto, the seat of culture and tradition, became a ruin. Battles raged street by street, temples and mansions burned, and once prosperous districts lay in ashes. The war dragged on without decisive victory, as alliances shifted and rivalries deepened. Warriors fought not for the shogunate's survival, but for their own gain, carving out power wherever opportunity arose. The emperor and court, powerless, watched as their capital crumbled around them. The Onin War ended without resolution in 1477, leaving Japan shattered. The shogunate, weakened and discredited, retained only nominal authority. Real power had devolved into the hands of the daimyo, who ruled their provinces as near-sovereign lords. The unity that Yoritomo had once forged, that Yoshimitsu had briefly revived, dissolved entirely. The land entered the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, where warlords contended for dominance in a ceaseless cycle of conflict and ambition. The consequences were profound. Warfare became endemic, shaping not only politics but the very fabric of society. Castles multiplied, villages fortified themselves, and common people found their lives tied to the shifting fortunes of local lords. Loyalty was measured less by tradition than by survival and reward. Samurai no longer looked to Kyoto or Kamakura for direction. They turned to whichever daimyo could protect them and offer land. Yet even amid devastation, the Sengoku period unleashed new forms of resilience and innovation. Local governance became sharper, armies more disciplined, and strategies more sophisticated. The warlords who rose during this age would transform Japan in ways no shogun had managed before. Out of the ashes of the Onin War, the stage was set for a century of upheaval, where ambition and violence would reshape the destiny of the nation. The Sengoku period, born from the ashes of the Onin War, unfolded as a century of ceaseless conflict and restless ambition. From the late 15th century through the 16th, Japan became a patchwork of competing domains, each ruled by a daimyo whose power rested not on decrees from Kyoto, but on the strength of his armies and the loyalty of his retainers. The authority of the Ashikaga shogunate dwindled to little more than a shadow, while real governance was decided on the battlefield. In this new landscape, the ideals of the past gave way to the realities of survival. Samurai who once looked toward the shogun or emperor for recognition now pledged their swords to whichever lord could provide land, security, and opportunity. Villages fortified themselves behind wooden palisades, temples became strongholds, and peasants were drawn into the cycle of war as conscripts or laborers. The old order had collapsed, replaced by a brutal competition in which only the strong or cunning could endure. Among the rising warlords were families whose names would echo through history. The Takeda clan, based in the mountains of Kai, cultivated a fearsome cavalry renowned for its speed and discipline. The Uesugi, entrenched in the northern provinces, projected power through both martial strength and spiritual authority. The Imagawa in the east, the Mori in the west, and countless other houses carved out territories, each seeking to expand at the expense of neighbors. Alliances shifted like the tides. Betrayal was commonplace. Survival demanded both courage and ruthless calculation. The Sengoku period also witnessed the transformation of warfare itself. No longer limited to skirmishes between small bands of mounted warriors, battles now involved tens of thousands of soldiers, organized into formations and supported by supply lines. Castles evolved from simple wooden forts into massive stone fortifications, dominating landscapes and serving as centers of administration. The introduction of firearms in the mid-16th century, brought by Portuguese traders, further altered the nature of combat as musket volleys began to supplement the sword and bow. Religion played its part in the turmoil. The rise of the Ikko-Ikki, leagues of Buddhist monks and peasant supporters bound by faith and opposition to oppressive lords, created pockets of fierce resistance. Armed with zeal as much as weapons, they defied even powerful daimyo, holding fortified temples and cities against prolonged sieges. These movements demonstrated how deeply the Sengoku chaos penetrated society, blurring the lines between warrior and commoner, ruler and subject. Amid the anarchy, opportunities for extraordinary individuals arose. Ambitious leaders could, through skill and audacity, rise from obscurity to command vast territories. The Sengoku period was thus both destructive and transformative, an age where the rigid hierarchies of earlier times gave way to merit and force of will. Men of low birth could ascend through valor, while great houses could crumble through miscalculation. The people of Japan endured immense suffering in this era. Fields were trampled by marching armies, villages burned, and famine often followed campaigns. Yet it was also an age of resilience. Local communities adapted to the constant threat of war, strengthening ties of cooperation and building systems of defense. Commerce, too, found ways to flourish as markets followed the armies, and merchants learned to profit from supplying both victors and losers alike. By the middle of the 16th century, the Sengoku period had produced figures of astonishing ambition, men who sought not merely survival, but the unification of all Japan. Among them would emerge Oda Nobunaga, whose ruthless brilliance began to shatter the pattern of endless fragmentation. But before his rise, the land would remain a cauldron of shifting fortunes, where every castle stood as both a fortress and a declaration of defiance, and where the future of the nation lay undecided amid the clash of swords and the thunder of muskets. In the midst of the Sengoku chaos, when countless lords vied for dominance and the land seemed doomed to perpetual strife, one figure began to rise above the rest. Oda Nobunaga, born into a minor clan in Owari province, would transform the course of Japanese history through audacity, innovation, and ruthless determination. His ascent from provincial obscurity to national prominence embodied the raw possibilities of the age, when birth mattered less than brilliance, and when the ambition of one man could reshape the fate of a fractured nation. Nobunaga's early years gave little hint of greatness. The Oda clan was not among the most powerful houses, controlling only a portion of Owari and racked by internal division. Yet even as a youth, Nobunaga revealed a character that shocked and unsettled his peers. He scorned traditional decorum, dressed flamboyantly, and acted with reckless energy. Elders dismissed him as unworthy, but beneath the veneer of eccentricity lay a mind of uncommon daring. When his father died in 1551, rivals expected him to falter. Instead, he crushed opposition within his clan, securing his position as Lord of Owari and laying the foundation for greater conquests. The Battle of Okehazama in 1560 marked Nobunaga's dramatic emergence. Facing Imagawa Yoshimoto, a warlord commanding a vastly superior force, Nobunaga appeared hopelessly outmatched. Yet he turned apparent weakness into advantage. With fewer than 3,000 men, he launched a surprise attack during a storm, catching the Imagawa army unprepared. Yoshimoto was slain, and his massive host scattered in panic. The victory electrified Japan, proving that audacity and cunning could overturn sheer numbers. From that day, Nobunaga was no longer a minor provincial lord, but a contender in the struggle for national power. What set Nobunaga apart was not merely his boldness, but his willingness to embrace change. He recognized the potential of firearms recently introduced by the Portuguese and used them with devastating effect. While other lords viewed muskets as little more than exotic curiosities, Nobunaga drilled his soldiers to fire in disciplined volleys, transforming chaotic gunfire into a weapon of strategy. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he demonstrated the full power of this innovation, annihilating the famed Takeda cavalry with walls of coordinated musket fire. The age of traditional mounted duels gave way to massed formations and tactical discipline, heralding a new era in Japanese warfare. Nobunaga's ambition extended beyond the battlefield. He sought to undermine the entrenched powers that resisted centralization. The great Buddhist temples, long fortified and armed with warrior monks, were formidable obstacles. Nobunaga regarded them not as sacred, but as political opponents. In 1571, he launched a brutal assault on Mount Hiei, burning its monasteries and slaughtering thousands. To many, the act was shocking sacrilege. To Nobunaga, it was necessary destruction of a rival power that threatened his authority. He did not hesitate to use terror as a weapon, believing fear could achieve what negotiation could not. Yet he was also a patron of trade and innovation. Nobunaga encouraged commerce, opening markets and reducing barriers that had long restricted movement. He fostered ties with Portuguese traders, welcoming new technologies, firearms, and even Western learning. By supporting the spread of Christianity, not from faith but from calculation, he gained allies against Buddhist powers while encouraging the flow of foreign goods. His rule thus combined brutality with vision, destruction with creation. As his power grew, Nobunaga turned his gaze toward Kyoto. In 1568, he marched into the capital, installing Ashikaga Yoshiaki as shogun. Yet the arrangement quickly soured, for Nobunaga had no intention of serving as mere enforcer of a figurehead. He sought true dominance, and when Yoshiaki resisted, Nobunaga stripped him of power, ending the Ashikaga shogunate entirely. For the first time since the fall of the Hojo, no shogun remained to cloak authority in tradition. Nobunaga ruled openly as the master of Japan's politics, unbound by precedent. By the 1570s, his power extended across central Japan. Rivals fell one by one, Asai, Asakura, Takeda, either crushed in battle or undone by betrayal. His banner of Tenka Fubu, rule the realm by force, captured both his ambition and his method. He envisioned a Japan unified not by fragile consensus, but by decisive conquest. Yet his ruthlessness bred enemies as quickly as it gained him victories. The land trembled under his campaigns, and though unification seemed closer than ever, his path was marked by both brilliance and brutality. By the late 1570s, Oda Nobunaga stood as the most powerful warlord in Japan. His conquests had broken the great houses of central Honshu, his reforms had reshaped warfare, and his dominance over Kyoto gave him unrivaled authority. Yet his ambitions extended further still. He sought nothing less than the unification of the realm under his rule, sweeping away the centuries of division that had plagued the land. His vision was bold, but his methods, marked by ferocity and unrelenting will, bred both fear and resentment. Nobunaga pressed relentlessly against remaining rivals. In the west, the formidable Mori clan resisted his advance, defending their maritime domains with tenacity. To the north, remnants of the Takeda still fought, though their strength had waned after the crushing defeat at Nagashino. Across the land, pockets of resistance held, but each year saw Nobunaga's forces grow stronger, his network of castles and allies expanding. He wielded not only armies, but also diplomacy, alternately rewarding loyalty and punishing defiance with ruthless efficiency. His relationship with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of his most capable generals, demonstrated Nobunaga's eye for talent. Hideyoshi, of humble origins, had risen through sheer brilliance and loyalty. Entrusted with crucial campaigns, he proved both resourceful and charismatic, securing victories that expanded Oda influence. Alongside him stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, a cautious but steadfast ally, whose domain in Mikawa provided stability on Nobunaga's eastern flank. Together, these men formed the core of a coalition that seemed unstoppable. Yet Nobunaga's uncompromising nature made enemies not only among rival clans, but also among his own followers. He tolerated no dissent, crushed temples, and humiliated subordinates who failed to meet his expectations. To some he appeared less a unifier than a tyrant. His assault on the Ishiyama Honganji, a massive temple fortress defended by warrior monks and their allies, dragged on for years, exemplifying both his determination and his ferocity. When it finally fell in 1580, the victory came at immense cost, leaving scars upon the land and deepening resentment among those who still clung to tradition. In 1582, Nobunaga seemed poised to complete his mission. He launched campaigns against the Mori in the west, while his generals pressed elsewhere to secure the realm. It was during this moment of triumph that betrayal struck. At Honnoji, a temple in Kyoto where Nobunaga had taken lodging, his retainer Akechi Mitsuhide turned against him. Leading his troops in a sudden assault, Mitsuhide surrounded the temple and demanded Nobunaga's surrender. Caught unprepared, with only a small guard, Nobunaga fought briefly, but realized escape was impossible. Facing capture and humiliation, he chose the path of the warrior. Setting fire to the temple around him, he took his own life, ending his career in a blaze that consumed both his body and his ambitions. The man who had brought Japan closer to unity than any since the fall of Kamakura perished not on a battlefield, but by the treachery of one who had served him. The shock of Nobunaga's death rippled across the land. Mitsuhide briefly claimed power, but his betrayal left him isolated, and within weeks he was defeated by Hideyoshi, who seized the mantle of leadership. For many, Nobunaga's fall seemed both tragic and inevitable, a man of unmatched vision, undone by the same ruthlessness that had carried him so far. His reign of conquest had shattered the old order, but he had not lived to see the unification he desired. Yet Nobunaga's legacy endured. He had transformed warfare, embraced innovation, and stripped away centuries of tradition that had bound the land to division. In his wake, Japan was irrevocably changed. The path to unification remained open, and though others would claim the final glory, it was Nobunaga who had first forced the fractured provinces to imagine a single, unified realm. In the chaos that followed Nobunaga's fiery death at Honnoji, it seemed as though Japan might once again dissolve into endless rivalry. Akechi Mitsuhide, the betrayer, claimed the mantle of power, but his grasp was tenuous. He lacked the broad alliances and fearsome reputation that Nobunaga had commanded, and his treachery alienated potential supporters. Into this vacuum stepped Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's most capable general, whose speed, cunning, and charisma allowed him to seize the moment and turn disaster into triumph. Hideyoshi's origins were as humble as they were remarkable. Born the son of a peasant foot soldier, he had entered Nobunaga's service as a lowly retainer, often mocked for his appearance and common birth. Yet his sharp mind, unflagging energy, and ability to win the loyalty of others propelled him upward. Nobunaga, ruthless but shrewd in recognizing talent, entrusted him with crucial campaigns. By the time of Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi was already a seasoned commander with his own following, respected by allies and feared by enemies. When news of the betrayal at Honnoji reached him, Hideyoshi acted with astonishing speed. Negotiating a swift truce with the Mori, against whom he had been campaigning, he redirected his army toward Kyoto. Within days, he confronted Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki. The confrontation was decisive. Hideyoshi's forces, bolstered by allies eager to avenge Nobunaga, overwhelmed the traitor's smaller host. Mitsuhide was defeated and killed while fleeing. In the span of 2 weeks, Hideyoshi had avenged his fallen master and positioned himself as the rightful heir to Nobunaga's vision. From that point, Hideyoshi's rise was inexorable. Unlike Nobunaga, who often ruled through fear, Hideyoshi combined ruthlessness with diplomacy. He was skilled in the art of persuasion, winning over former rivals through promises of land, marriage alliances, and titles. He cultivated loyalty not only by force, but by making men feel invested in his cause. His charisma and pragmatism allowed him to unite factions that might otherwise have torn Japan apart after Nobunaga's death. Hideyoshi continued the project of unification with relentless energy. He subdued remaining opposition in central Honshu, then turned to the west, defeating the Mori and bringing their powerful domain under his sway. He forced the submission of Shikoku, Kyushu, and other regions, extending his influence across the islands with a mixture of conquest and diplomacy. By the mid-1590s, nearly all of Japan acknowledged his authority. For the first time in centuries, the dream of national unity was no longer a fleeting ambition but a reality. As his power solidified, Hideyoshi adopted titles that elevated him above his warrior peers while maintaining deference to the imperial court. In 1586, he became Kampaku, the imperial regent, a role traditionally reserved for noble families. Though born a commoner, he now stood as the most powerful man in the country, cloaking his authority in the legitimacy of courtly rank. His rule demonstrated how far Japan had moved from rigid hierarchies, for in the Sengoku chaos, merit and ambition had carried a man of peasant birth to the pinnacle of power. Hideyoshi also sought to bind the samurai class more firmly to his authority. He ordered nationwide land surveys to assess productivity and clarify ownership, ensuring that taxes and obligations were properly allocated. He introduced the sword hunt, confiscating weapons from peasants to prevent uprisings and to reinforce the distinction between farmers and warriors. These measures created a more orderly society, reducing the fluidity of status that had characterized the Sengoku period and laying the groundwork for a rigid social hierarchy that would persist into the Tokugawa era. Yet Hideyoshi's ambitions reached beyond the shores of Japan. With the country largely unified, he began to dream of conquests abroad, campaigns against Korea and even China. His vision extended beyond mere domestic rule to a broader stage of empire. These grand designs would test the limits of his authority, stretching resources and loyalty in ways that revealed the fragility beneath his achievements. For now, however, Hideyoshi stood triumphant. He had avenged Nobunaga, pacified the land, and risen from obscurity to command an entire nation. His rule embodied both the promise and the peril of the Sengoku age, proving that talent and ambition could overcome birth, but also hinting at how difficult it would be to preserve unity in a land long accustomed to division. By the 1590s, Toyotomi Hideyoshi stood as the unchallenged master of Japan. The Sengoku period's endless wars had given way, at least briefly, to a fragile unity under his leadership. Yet for a man whose life had defied every convention, rising from peasant origins to rule a nation, mere consolidation was not enough. His vision stretched beyond the islands of Japan, reaching across the sea toward the vastness of Asia. In his mind, the conquest of Korea and eventually China would not only secure Japan's dominance, but also etch his name alongside the great conquerors of history. In 1592, he launched the first invasion of Korea, known as the Imjin War. It was an audacious undertaking, requiring the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and a fleet capable of crossing the treacherous straits. Hideyoshi envisioned a lightning campaign. Japan's disciplined armies would march swiftly across the Korean peninsula, subduing resistance, and then advance into China itself. The plan was grand, reflecting both his ambition and his impatience to secure glory beyond Japan's shores. At first, Japanese forces achieved dramatic successes. Veteran samurai, hardened by decades of civil war, overwhelmed Korean defenses and captured key cities with startling speed. Korean armies, unprepared for the ferocity and discipline of Hideyoshi's troops, fell back in disarray. Within months, much of the peninsula was in Japanese hands. To Hideyoshi, it seemed the first step toward a continental empire was within his grasp. Yet the campaign soon faltered. The Korean Navy, commanded by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, proved a formidable opponent. With innovative turtle ships and mastery of local waters, Yi's fleet cut off Japanese supply lines, stranding armies far from home. The Chinese Ming dynasty, alarmed by the invasion, dispatched reinforcements to aid Korea. Battles dragged on, with Japanese troops stretched thin and unable to achieve decisive victories. What had begun as a bold thrust toward empire devolved into a costly stalemate. In 1593, a truce was negotiated, though neither side fully conceded. Hideyoshi, still obsessed with conquest, prepared for another attempt. In 1597, a second invasion was launched, larger but less coherent. By then, exhaustion gripped Japan. The prolonged campaigns drained resources, disrupted agriculture, and strained the loyalty of warriors who had expected quick triumphs and rich rewards. The fighting in Korea turned brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides, but the strategic situation never improved. Once again, Admiral Yi and the Ming armies blunted Japanese advances. Hideyoshi's health began to fail during these years, and with it, his grip on events. He never set foot on Korean soil, directing the campaigns from Japan with alternating bursts of energy and despair. His dream of continental conquest consumed him, but his generals grew weary and his people burdened. When he died in 1598, the armies in Korea withdrew, leaving behind only devastation and bitterness. The grand vision of empire had collapsed, undone by overreach and the realities of geopolitics. The Korean invasions revealed both the greatness and the limits of Hideyoshi. He had united Japan and projected its power abroad, achievements that no lord before him had accomplished. Yet his ambitions outstripped his resources, and his failure exposed the fragility of his system. Without new lands to distribute, the delicate balance of loyalty he had maintained among the samurai began to falter. His death left Japan unified but unsettled, uncertain of how to preserve the order he had imposed. Still, his legacy endured. He had ended centuries of fragmentation, created a more structured society, and demonstrated the potential of Japan to act as a unified force. His invasions, though disastrous, etched Japan into the broader stage of East Asia, marking the country as a power that could no longer be ignored. Hideyoshi had dreamed of empire and fallen short, but in doing so he had set the stage for the final act of unification under a man whose patience and caution contrasted sharply with his own, Tokugawa Ieyasu. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in 1598, he left behind a unified but fragile Japan. His dream of empire on the Asian continent had collapsed, his armies withdrawn from Korea in exhaustion and defeat. At home, the structures he had built, land surveys, class divisions, centralized authority, remained, but they rested on uncertain ground. Hideyoshi's heir, Toyotomi Hideyori, was only a child, too young to command loyalty or maintain the delicate balance of power among ambitious warlords. Into this vacuum stepped Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man of patience, calculation, and iron resolve, who would seize the moment and shape Japan's future. Ieyasu's rise had been long in the making. A contemporary of both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, he had survived the chaos of the Sengoku era by mastering the art of endurance. While others rushed into battles that consumed them, Ieyasu preserved his strength, building his base in the fertile Kanto region. From his castle at Edo, he cultivated resources, forged alliances, and waited. His loyalty to Nobunaga and cooperation with Hideyoshi had ensured his survival, but his ambitions extended far beyond mere survival. With Hideyoshi gone, the time had come for Ieyasu to act. Tensions quickly surfaced among the great lords. Hideyoshi had created a council of 5 elders to govern until his son came of age, but rivalries split the council. Ieyasu, as its most powerful member, began consolidating influence, arranging marriages and securing alliances that favored his clan. Opponents rallied around Ishida Mitsunari, a capable but unpopular administrator who positioned himself as defender of the Toyotomi legacy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide not just the fate of Hideyori, but of all Japan. In 1600, the conflict erupted in full. The nation divided into 2 camps, the Eastern Army under Ieyasu and the Western Army under Ishida Mitsunari. Samurai across the land were forced to choose sides, weighing loyalty, ambition, and survival. The 2 armies maneuvered for advantage, their movements culminating in the broad plains of Sekigahara in central Japan. There, on an autumn morning shrouded in mist, the greatest battle in Japanese history began. Tens of thousands of warriors assembled, banners snapping in the wind, drums pounding as orders rang out across the field. The clash was immense, a thunder of arrows, muskets, and steel that shook the valley. For hours the outcome remained uncertain, as lines surged and broke, and commanders hurled their men into the fray. Yet Ieyasu's careful planning began to bear fruit. He had quietly secured promises from several Western commanders to betray Mitsunari at the crucial moment. As the sun rose higher, those betrayals unfolded. Kobayakawa Hideaki, hesitating at first, suddenly turned his troops against the Western Army. Other defections followed, unraveling Mitsunari's forces from within. What had begun as a balanced struggle became a rout. The Western Army collapsed, its leaders captured or slain. Mitsunari himself was taken prisoner and later executed, his cause extinguished. Sekigahara was more than a battlefield victory. It was the decisive turning point that ended a century of civil war. Ieyasu's triumph placed him beyond challenge, the undisputed master of Japan. With the Toyotomi heir still a child, his authority was cloaked in legitimacy as guardian, yet all understood that he ruled by his own right. His patient strategy, his ability to endure while others consumed themselves, had at last brought him to supremacy. In the aftermath, Ieyasu rewarded allies and punished enemies, redistributing lands to secure loyalty. Domains were reorganized, with trusted supporters placed in strategic provinces, and rivals reduced or eliminated. The system that would define the Tokugawa shogunate began to take shape, rooted in careful balance, surveillance, and control. Edo, once a provincial castle town, now rose as the center of a new political order. Sekigahara thus marked not only the end of the Sengoku chaos, but the beginning of a new age. The blood-soaked fields of that October morning became the foundation upon which Ieyasu would build a shogunate that endured for more than 2 centuries. Unity, long a dream pursued through fire and ambition, was now within reach. With his triumph at Sekigahara in 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged as the supreme power in Japan. Yet battlefield victory alone could not ensure lasting rule. For centuries, other clans had risen high only to collapse in the storms of ambition and rebellion. Ieyasu, patient as ever, knew that the true test was not conquest but consolidation. To secure his legacy, he built a system of governance designed not for fleeting glory, but for stability across generations. In 1603, the emperor formally appointed Ieyasu as Sei Taishogun. With that title, the Tokugawa shogunate was born. Unlike the brief experiments of the Kamakura and Ashikaga, this new order would endure. Its center was Edo, the castle town Ieyasu had nurtured in the Kanto plains. From Edo, he and his descendants would rule for more than 250 years, creating a peace so profound that it redefined the character of Japanese society. The cornerstone of Ieyasu's system was the bakuhan structure, a balance between the shogunate, bakufu, and the domains, han, of the daimyo. Each lord retained control of his territory, but ultimate authority rested with the shogun. Loyalty was secured through a web of obligations and careful distribution of land. Allies of Sekigahara received vast domains, while former enemies were left with smaller, less strategic holdings, ensuring that no single rival could threaten the Tokugawa center. To prevent rebellion, Ieyasu and his successors imposed measures of control. The most effective was the Sankin Kotai system, in which daimyo were required to alternate their residence between Edo and their home provinces. Their families remained in Edo as hostages, a subtle yet powerful means of ensuring obedience. Roads were improved to facilitate this movement, unintentionally stimulating commerce and communication across the land. What began as a mechanism of control became a force that knitted the country together. The Tokugawa also sought to fix the social order. Hideyoshi's earlier separation of warriors, farmers, artisans, and merchants was maintained, but under Tokugawa rule, it became rigid, codified in law and practice. Samurai were forbidden from farming, peasants were bound to the land, artisans produced goods, merchants conducted trade. While such divisions limited mobility, they created stability in a society weary of upheaval. Samurai, once free-roaming warriors, now became administrators, bureaucrats, and guardians of peace rather than constant fighters. Ieyasu also turned his mind to the question of foreign influence. Trade with Europe had introduced firearms, Christianity, and new goods, but it also carried the seeds of disruption. To preserve stability, the shogunate grew increasingly wary of foreign faith and commerce. While not yet fully isolationist, Ieyasu and his heirs began to restrict missionary activity and monitor contact with outsiders. The balance between openness and control would eventually tilt towards seclusion, but the foundation was laid during his reign. After securing his power, Ieyasu retired formally in 1605, passing the title of shogun to his son Hidetada, though he continued to guide policy as ogosho, or retired shogun. This act was both practical and symbolic. It ensured smooth succession and demonstrated that Tokugawa authority was no accident of personality, but an institution meant to endure. The lesson was clear. Rule must pass from father to son without disruption, binding generations in continuity. Ieyasu's final act of consolidation came in 1615 at the siege of Osaka. The Toyotomi family, still revered by many, held the great Osaka castle under Hideyoshi's son Hideyori. Though decades had passed since Hideyoshi's death, his bloodline remained a symbol of resistance. Ieyasu moved decisively, besieging Osaka in 2 campaigns. After bitter fighting, the castle fell and Hideyori perished. With the Toyotomi extinguished, no rival remained to challenge Tokugawa supremacy. The peace that followed was unlike anything Japan had known for centuries. Castles ceased to be battlegrounds and became administrative centers. Swords were worn more as symbols of status than as tools of war. Roads bustled with merchants. Farmers tilled their fields without fear of armies trampling their crops, and culture flourished in the relative security of the age. Ieyasu had turned a land of chaos into a land of order. The Tokugawa shogunate was not without flaws, but it achieved what no other regime had managed: stability that endured for more than 2 centuries. Ieyasu's legacy was not only victory, but the creation of a system that bound ambition, rewarded loyalty, and tamed the restless energy of the warrior class. He had outlasted Nobunaga's fire and Hideyoshi's brilliance with patience and foresight, securing for his descendants a peace that would define an era. The establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603 ushered Japan into a new era, one that would come to be known as the Edo period. After centuries of turmoil, the land finally settled into peace under the careful balance of control and order devised by Tokugawa Ieyasu and maintained by his descendants. The swords of the samurai, once stained daily on battlefields, now rested in scabbards as symbols of rank and heritage. The rhythm of life shifted from the chaos of war to the steady patterns of stability, commerce, and culture. Isolation became one of the defining features of this age. Having witnessed the disruptive influence of foreign missionaries and trade, the Tokugawa gradually restricted contact with the outside world. By the 1630s, the policy of sakoku, or closed country, was firmly established. Japanese were forbidden to travel abroad, and foreigners were tightly controlled, with limited trade confined to carefully regulated ports such as Nagasaki. This seclusion shielded Japan from external threats and preserved its stability, though it also limited exposure to broader global currents. Within the boundaries of isolation, society flourished in new ways. The rigid class structure imposed by the Tokugawa created predictability, even if it curtailed mobility. Samurai, though no longer warriors in constant battle, served as administrators and retainers, their stipends tied to rice production rather than plunder. Farmers produced the lifeblood of the economy, while artisans and merchants, though ranked lowest, grew increasingly wealthy through the expansion of commerce. Edo itself, once a provincial town, transformed into one of the largest cities in the world, its streets teeming with merchants, performers, and pilgrims. Culture blossomed under the shelter of peace. The world of the theatre flourished, with kabuki captivating audiences through bold costumes, dramatic gestures, and stories of both romance and tragedy. The art of ukiyo-e, woodblock prints, depicting scenes of everyday life, actors and courtesans, captured the vibrancy of the floating world, a culture of pleasure and ephemerality. Tea ceremony, calligraphy, and haiku poetry deepened the aesthetic sensibility of the era, balancing simplicity with refinement. In the quiet order of Tokugawa Japan, beauty became both discipline and escape. Religion and philosophy also took on new dimensions. Neo-Confucianism, with its emphasis on hierarchy and duty, became a guiding principle of governance, justifying the rigid social order. Zen Buddhism influenced art and aesthetics, while Shinto traditions persisted in festivals and shrines. Together, these currents provided a spiritual framework that reinforced stability, even as new ideas slowly percolated beneath the surface. Despite its stability, the Tokugawa system was not without strains. The rigid hierarchy sometimes suffocated ambition, and the samurai class, deprived of constant war, often struggled to adapt to bureaucratic roles. Merchants, technically the lowest class, amassed wealth that outstripped that of many warriors, creating tensions between status and reality. Yet for centuries the system endured, its contradictions contained by the sheer weight of order and tradition. The Edo period represented a profound transformation of Japan. Where once the land had been fractured by warlords, now it pulsed with trade along well-ordered roads. Where once emperors and shoguns struggled for supremacy, now the balance of power was settled, the emperor honored in Kyoto, but the shogun ruling firmly from Edo. Where once warriors sought glory in battle, now they sought meaning in culture, philosophy, and service. By the time Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in the 19th century, the Tokugawa order had lasted more than 250 years. Its peace allowed for population growth, economic expansion, and cultural flowering, but its seclusion left Japan vulnerable to the shock of sudden foreign contact. The end of the Edo period would bring new upheaval, but the legacy of Tokugawa stability remained indelible. The long arc of Japan's medieval history, from the rise of the Taira to the Genpei War, from the Mongol invasions to the Sengoku chaos, and from Nobunaga's fire to Tokugawa's patience, had at last reached resolution. The samurai, once restless wanderers and rebels, had become the stewards of an orderly society. Out of centuries of struggle, Japan had forged not only a new government but a new identity, poised between tradition and change, awaiting the next chapter in its story.